How's it going, my tired buddies? I know you guys rely on these videos for deep sleep, so let's snuggle up fast. And let me tell you another story here tonight, where we get to travel back to a Britain that existed in the space between black and white and colour, between the buttoned-up propriety of the post-war years and the looser, stranger decade that would follow. This is the calm and deep story of how crimes were solved when computers were the size of rooms, when fingerprints were still considered cutting-edge technology, and when a good detective's most important tool was often just the ability to notice things that others missed. So if you're new here as always, joining the community is super easy. Just tap subscribe and like the video and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, get cozy, turn on your fan for some noise and let's begin. Imagine waking up on a Tuesday morning in 1963, somewhere in a modest semi-detached house in suburban Manchester, or Birmingham, or any of a dozen similar cities across Britain. The alarm clock, one of those wind-up affairs with the twin bells on top, rattles to life at 6:30 and you shuffle to the bathroom in slippers that have seen better days. The Britain outside your window is a curious hybrid of old and new. Some homes on your street still have outside toilets, relics of Victorian construction that nobody's gotten around to modernising. But there's also a television aerial sprouting from nearly every rooftop, and if you listen carefully you can hear the distant rumble of morning traffic that's beginning to clog roads never designed for this many vehicles. For Detective Inspector Thomas Henley, let's call him Tom because everyone at the station does, this particular Tuesday begins like most others. He shaves with a safety razor over a porcelain sink, the mirror still foggy from the limited hot water his immersion heater provides. His wife has already been up for an hour, preparing breakfast in a kitchen where a new electric kettle sits proudly next to the old stovetop one she can't quite bring herself to discard. The smell of toast and marmalade drifts up the stairs. This is the Britain of hearty breakfasts, where a proper meal means fried eggs, bacon, grilled tomatoes, and toast soldiers if you're feeling particularly traditional. Tom's wife believes a man can't possibly solve crimes on an empty stomach, and who is he to argue with 3 decades of married wisdom? The newspaper waiting by his plate carries headlines about the Profumo scandal and the Beatles' latest chart success. This peculiar moment when Britain seems caught between its stiff upper lip past and something looser, younger, and decidedly more colourful. But Tom is more interested in the local news section, where a small article mentions a burglary at a chemist shop on the high street. Not his case, but he reads it anyway, because a good detective develops habits of attention that extend beyond official assignments. His journey to the station takes him through streets that would be unrecognisable to someone from our time. The corner shop, not yet called a convenience store, displays hand-lettered signs advertising prices in pounds, shillings, and pence. The tobacconist is doing brisk business even at this hour, because smoking is something nearly everyone does, everywhere, all the time. The local pub won't open for hours yet, but its windows are already being washed by someone who takes pride in keeping the etched glass gleaming. Tom walks past the new Wimpy Bar, which opened last month and represents the leading edge of American-style fast food culture creeping into British life. The teenagers love it, though Tom can't quite understand paying money for something called a hamburger when a proper fish and chips shop is right across the street. But then again, he's never quite understood teenagers, even when he was one. The police station is a solid Victorian building that smells perpetually of floor wax, damp wool, and the particular mustiness that seems to accumulate in any British institution of sufficient age. The front desk sergeant nods as Tom enters, a gesture they have exchanged nearly every working day for 15 years. Some partnerships are built on conversation, theirs is built on comfortable silence and shared understanding. Tom's office is on the 2nd floor, upstairs that creak in a way that announces visitors long before they arrive. The room contains a desk, 2 filing cabinets, a telephone that connects to the switchboard downstairs through a system of mysterious clicks and buzzes, and a window that looks out onto a car park slowly filling with Morris Minors, Ford Anglias, and the occasional Rover belonging to someone higher up the chain of command. The morning briefing won't start for another 20 minutes, so Tom uses the time to review his active cases. There's the matter of the missing garden gnomes from the residential area near the park. Probably teenagers, though proving it will require either catching them in the act or someone's mother finding a dozen ceramic gnomes hidden in their son's bedroom. There's a string of shoplifting incidents at the Woolworths that suggest either the same person returning repeatedly, or a small group working together. And there's the peculiar business of threatening letters being sent to the headmaster of the local grammar school, written in block capitals on paper that might have come from anywhere. None of these are murders or bank robberies or the kinds of cases that make headlines. They're the steady, unglamorous work of maintaining order in a community where most people are basically decent, but occasionally fall into bad decisions or temporary madness. Tom has solved exactly 3 murders in his career, and each one was solved through patience, attention to detail, and the kind of shoe-leather detective work that involves knocking on doors until someone mentions something useful. The tea trolley arrives, pushed by Mrs. Patterson, who's been providing tea to police officers since before Tom joined the force. She knows everyone's preference. Tom takes his with milk and 1 sugar, though his doctor has suggested he might want to cut back on the sugar. The tea is strong enough to stand a spoon in, brewed in a pot that's probably older than some of the younger constables, and served in cups that don't quite match because institutional crockery has a way of gradually becoming an eclectic collection. This is how detective work begins in 1960s Britain, not with dramatic car chases or shootouts, but with tea, paperwork, and the quiet accumulation of small details that might, eventually, form a pattern worth investigating. If you've ever watched a modern crime show, you've probably seen detectives request DNA analysis, check surveillance footage, and pull up computer records that tell them everything about a suspect in seconds. Now imagine doing that same job with none of those tools, and you'll begin to understand the particular challenges facing British detectives in the 1960s. Tom's filing cabinets contain what passes for a database in this era. Folders organised alphabetically, then by date containing handwritten notes, typed reports done on manual typewriters that require real finger strength, and photographs developed in the darkroom in the basement. Finding information means remembering where you filed it, because there's no search function beyond your own memory, and whatever organisational system you've managed to maintain. The telephone on his desk connects to other police stations through operators who manually plug cables into switchboards, creating connections that sometimes involve waiting several minutes for a line to become available. Long-distance calls to Scotland Yard in London require planning and often involve frustrating delays, where you can hear other conversations bleeding through the line, ghostly fragments of other people's business mixing with your own. Fingerprint analysis exists and is considered remarkably sophisticated, but it requires first lifting prints from a crime scene using powder and tape, then photographing them, then manually comparing them to cards in files that are organised by pattern type, whorls, loops and arches. An experienced fingerprint examiner can perform this matching work with impressive accuracy, but it takes hours or days rather than the seconds you see on television. Photography is both essential and frustratingly limited. Crime scene photographs must be taken with film cameras, which means you get one chance to capture each angle correctly. There's no deleting and trying again, no checking the image on a screen to make sure you got it right. The film must be developed, which means waiting, and prints must be made, which means waiting more. A complete photographic record of a crime scene might not be available until the following day, by which time memories have already started to fade and details to blur. The forensic laboratory that serves Tom's region is located in a converted country house, an hour's drive away, staffed by scientists who work with microscopes, chemical reagents, and the kind of meticulous attention to detail that would make a watchmaker nod with approval. They can analyse blood types, examine textile fibres, identify soil samples, and perform other tests that would have seemed like magic a generation earlier. But each test takes time, requires careful documentation, and produces results that must be interpreted by people who understand both science and its limitations. Tom has learned to work within these constraints through a combination of experience, intuition, and what he thinks of as aggressive common sense. When a burglar strikes, Tom doesn't wait for forensic results before beginning his investigation. Instead, he walks the neighbourhood, talking to people, asking about strangers they might have noticed, unusual vehicles, or anything that broke the normal pattern of their daily routines. Most people are surprisingly observant about their own streets, even if they don't realise it. Mrs. Jenkins at number 43 might not think she knows anything useful, but when Tom asks the right questions, she remembers that there was a van parked on the corner Tuesday afternoon. Unusual because it's normally permit parking only, and she noticed because she was worried about getting a ticket herself. That van probably means nothing, but Tom writes it down anyway, because you never know which detail will matter until you've assembled enough of them to see a pattern. The local Bobby, the police constable who walks the same beat every day, becoming a familiar fixture in his neighbourhood, is one of Tom's most valuable resources. P.C. Williams knows everyone on his patch, knows which teenagers are heading for trouble, and which ones are just going through a phase, knows which houses have been empty during the day, and which shops have had new employees recently. This kind of knowledge can't be stored in any filing system. It exists only in human memory, and the relationships built through years of daily contact. When Tom needs to check someone's background, he can't simply run their name through a computer. Instead, he places telephone calls to other stations, sends telegrams to the central registry, and sometimes writes actual letters that travel through the post, waiting days for replies that might or might not contain useful information. Criminal records exist, but they're paper documents stored in specific locations, and accessing them requires knowing where to look and having the patience to wait for files to be retrieved and copied. The interview room where Tom questions suspects and witnesses is furnished with a table, 3 chairs, and nothing else. There's no two-way mirror, no recording equipment, and no video cameras documenting every moment. Instead, a constable sits in the corner taking notes in shorthand, creating a written record that will later be typed up and filed. The accuracy of this record depends entirely on the constable's skill, attention, and honesty. There's no backup, no way to review what was actually said beyond what someone wrote down. This means that a detective's memory, observation skills, and ability to read people become paramount. Tom has trained himself to notice body language, to hear what people aren't saying, and to spot the small inconsistencies in someone's story that might indicate deception or confusion. He's learned that the truth usually emerges not in dramatic confrontations, but in quiet moments when someone lets their guard down, often over tea, often when they think the formal interview has ended. The tools of 1960s detective work are fundamentally human. Attention, patience, persistence, and the ability to convince people to tell you things they might prefer to keep hidden. Technology helps, fingerprints, photographs, forensic analysis, but these are supplements to human judgment rather than replacements for it. The morning briefing is held in a room with a large map of the district pinned to one wall, marked with coloured pins indicating different types of incidents. Red for burglaries, blue for assaults, green for traffic accidents, and yellow for what the sergeant calls miscellaneous mischief. The pattern of pins tells a story to anyone who knows how to read it. Clusters near the train station suggesting opportunistic theft, a line of red pins along the main shopping street, and isolated blues in residential areas that usually involve domestic situations nobody wants to discuss. Detective Chief Inspector Morrison runs these briefings with the efficiency of someone who learned his trade during the war and sees no reason to waste words. He's the sort of man who uses a pipe as a prop, pointing with it to emphasise certain points, consulting it during thoughtful silences, and occasionally forgetting to actually light it. The younger officers find this mildly amusing, but nobody mentions it because Morrison is both respected and slightly feared in the way that very competent people often are. Tom's assignment for the day involves following up on the threatening letters to the grammar school headmaster. The letters themselves are unsettling without being explicitly dangerous. Vague warnings about consequences and justice, written in pencil on cheap-lined paper that could have come from any newsagent in Britain. The handwriting is deliberately disguised. each letter formed carefully in block capitals that tell you nothing about the writer's natural hand. The school itself is a Victorian Gothic structure that was probably impressive when it was built, but now just looks stern and slightly forbidding. The headmaster's office smells of old books, furniture polish, and the peculiar mustiness that seems to pervade British educational institutions. Headmaster Richardson is a man in his late 50s who still wears an academic gown for assemblies and believes firmly that education should build character as well as knowledge. Richardson has kept all 5 letters in a folder, handling them by the corners to preserve any fingerprints, though he's probably contaminated them thoroughly already. Tom examines each one carefully, noting that they're written on different paper, suggesting either the writer has access to multiple sources or is deliberately varying the materials. The messages are similar but not identical, each one slightly escalating the implied threat while remaining just vague enough to avoid being actionable. What's interesting is what the letters don't say. There's no specific grievance mentioned, no clear demand, and no indication of what the writer actually wants. This suggests either someone who enjoys causing anxiety for its own sake, or someone building toward a demand they haven't yet articulated. Tom's experience tells him this is likely either a disgruntled former employee or a parent who feels their child was treated unfairly. The 2 most common sources of grievances against school administrators. He spends the next several hours conducting interviews. The school secretary, who has worked there for 20 years and knows everyone, can't think of anyone who would do such a thing. The deputy head, who handles disciplinary matters, mentions 3 recent expulsions, but doesn't believe any of the parents involved would resort to anonymous letters. The caretaker, who sees the building from a different angle than the academic staff, recalls that someone tried to break into the chemistry lab last month, though nothing was taken. Each interview adds a small piece to a puzzle that doesn't yet have a clear shape. Tom takes notes in a pocket notebook, writing in a personal shorthand he's developed over decades. Not the formal shorthand used by secretaries, but his own system of abbreviations and symbols that would be nearly illegible to anyone else. The notebook itself is a physical record that he'll later transcribe into formal reports, but in the moment, it's just a way of capturing thoughts before they evaporate. Lunchtime finds Tom at the local cafe, the sort of establishment that serves meat pies, mashed potatoes and tea strong enough to revive the dead. The cafe is run by a woman named Doris, who's been feeding local workers for 30 years and has opinions about everything from politics to proper pie crust. Tom eats here several times a week, partly because the food is decent and cheap, partly because Doris sees and hears everything that happens on this street, making her cafe an unofficial intelligence gathering operation disguised as a working-class restaurant. Today, Doris mentions that young Billy Thompson, one of the teenagers Tom suspects in the garden gnome thefts, was in yesterday spending money on the new pinball machine. This is notable because Billy's family isn't well off, and unexplained wealth in a teenage boy usually means either employment that his mother doesn't know about, or income from activities she definitely doesn't know about. It's a small detail, possibly meaningless, but Tom files it away in the mental drawer labelled worth checking. The afternoon is spent on the more tedious aspects of police work, typing reports, making telephone calls, and reviewing witness statements from other officers. Tom's typing is competent but not elegant, the product of a brief course years ago that taught him hunt and peck efficiency without any claim to proper technique. Each keystroke requires real force on the manual typewriter, and errors must be corrected with a special erasing paper that never quite makes the page clean again. A telephone call to the paper manufacturer reveals that the paper used in the threatening letters is sold at approximately 300 shops across the region, too common to be useful for narrowing down suspects. A call to a handwriting expert suggests the disguised printing is probably done by someone educated, based on certain letter formations that suggest familiarity with cursive writing. These aren't breakthroughs, but they're data points that gradually constrain the universe of possibilities. By late afternoon, Tom has developed a theory that he can't yet prove. The letters strike him as coming from someone with some connection to education, not necessarily a teacher, but someone who speaks the language of schools and understands their hierarchies. The lack of specific grievances suggests someone nursing a general resentment rather than a particular wrong, and the careful preparation, different papers, disguised handwriting, envelopes posted from different locations, suggests someone methodical and patient. He decides to request the school's personnel records for the past 10 years, looking for anyone who left under circumstances that might breed resentment. It's a long shot that will require hours of reading through files, but long shots and patient reading are what detective work actually consists of, as opposed to the dramatic revelations that populate fictional mysteries. The day ends with Tom walking back through streets now busy with evening commuters, shops closing for the day, and the smell of dinners cooking behind the curtained windows of terraced houses. He carries his case files home in a leather satchel that's starting to show its age, planning to spend the evening reviewing statements while his wife watches television in the next room. This is the rhythm of detective work in 1960 Britain. Long stretches of routine punctuated by moments of significance that only become apparent in retrospect, patterns emerging slowly from accumulated detail, and truth revealed not through brilliant deduction, but through thorough, patient, unglamorous labour. One of the peculiar aspects of police work in the 1960s is how visible it remained to ordinary citizens. There's no internet to report crimes anonymously, no social media to follow investigations from a distance. Instead, crime and its investigation happen in physical spaces where people can see and participate in the process. The police box on the corner near the main shopping district is one of these visible symbols of law enforcement. It's a blue-painted wooden structure, not unlike the TARDIS from Doctor Who, containing a telephone that connects directly to the station. Local officers use it as a reporting point, and citizens can use it to report crimes or request assistance. There's something reassuring about its solid presence, a physical reminder that help is theoretically available at the corner of Oak Street and the High Road. When a burglary occurs, neighbours gather to discuss it, not on online forums, but on front steps and over garden fences, sharing theories and observations with the kind of engagement that social media would later channel into different forms. Mrs. Patterson saw someone unfamiliar walking past around tea time. Mr. Chen at the Chinese restaurant noticed a vehicle idling where it shouldn't have been. The postman remembers that the house was empty during his rounds because usually someone answers when he needs a signature. These conversations create an informal network of surveillance that predates CCTV by decades. People notice things not because they're particularly observant, but because the rhythm of daily life in residential neighbourhoods follows predictable patterns, and deviations from those patterns stand out like misplaced notes in familiar music. Tom has learned to tap into this network through community relationships that he's carefully cultivated over years. The newsagent knows him by name and often mentions unusual purchases, someone buying an odd number of the same newspaper perhaps, or a stranger asking detailed questions about the neighbourhood. The librarian at the public library, a formidable woman named Miss Thornbury, who runs her institution with the precision of a military operation, notices who reads what and occasionally mentions when someone's interests strike her as unusual. This isn't official police work exactly. There are no reports filed about these casual conversations, no formal records of information gathered while buying tobacco or returning library books, but it's the substrate on which actual investigation builds, the community context that helps detectives understand what's normal and what's not. The relationship between police and public in 1960s Britain exists in an interesting space. There's more deference to authority than would be common a generation later. Officers are still called sir by most people, and there's a general assumption that police are basically working on the side of good, even if individual officers might be more or less competent. But there's also a wariness, particularly among working-class communities, where police have historically been seen as enforcers of rules made by and for other people. Tom navigates this territory through a combination of fairness, honesty, and what his wife calls his relentless reasonableness. He doesn't pretend to be something he's not. He's clearly middle class, clearly educated, and clearly part of the establishment. But he treats everyone with the same straightforward respect, whether he's interviewing a company director or a market porter, and people generally respond to that consistency. When a shoplifting case brings Tom into contact with a teenage girl caught stealing makeup from Boots, He doesn't lecture her about morality or threaten her with dire consequences. Instead, he asks her why. Not aggressively, just genuinely curious about what drove this particular decision on this particular day. The girl, expecting to be treated as a criminal, finds herself instead talking to someone who seems interested in understanding rather than judging. It turns out she was trying to impress an older group of girls who had essentially dared her to steal something. Not an excuse exactly, but a context that transforms the incident from simple criminality into something more complex: peer pressure, adolescent insecurity, and the desperate desire to belong that can drive people to decisions they know are wrong even as they're making them. Tom arranges for the girl to return to the store to apologise and work off the value of the stolen items through supervised community service. It's not official police business to arrange such things, but the store manager is willing, the girl's mother is relieved, and everyone involved gets something closer to justice than a formal prosecution would have provided. These small interventions, unofficial, unrecorded, barely visible even to other police officers, are where Tom does some of his most important work. The newspapers of the era treat crime stories with a particular style that blends sensationalism with peculiarly British understatement. A brutal assault might be described as an unfortunate incident, while a garden gnome theft could warrant dramatic headlines if it's a slow news week. Tom has learned to work with journalists, feeding them just enough information to keep them satisfied without compromising investigations or invading victims' privacy more than necessary. One reporter, Jenkins from the local paper, has been covering police news for 15 years and has developed an almost supernatural ability to appear at crime scenes shortly after the police themselves. Tom suspects Jenkins has connections at the station, possibly someone on the switchboard who tips him off, but can't prove it and isn't entirely sure he wants to. Jenkins is generally fair in his reporting, and the relationship between police and press, while sometimes tense, is built on mutual need and grudging respect. The forensic laboratory where Tom occasionally visits occupies a converted manor house on the outskirts of the city, its Victorian grandeur now dedicated to the systematic analysis of blood, fibre and trace evidence. The scientists who work here are a particular breed, methodical, patient and possessed of the kind of attention to microscopic detail that would drive most people to distraction. Dr. Margaret Chen runs the textile analysis section, working with a microscope that she treats with the reverence most people reserve for religious artifacts. She can identify fibre types by their cellular structure, distinguish cotton from different regions based on subtle variations in growth patterns, and determine with reasonable accuracy how long a fibre has been separated from its source material. Her testimony in court is delivered with the calm precision of someone explaining simple facts to people who happen to be less informed, and juries generally believe her because she makes complexity feel accessible without dumbing it down. Tom brings her a fibre found on a windowsill at a burglary scene. A single thread, barely visible, caught on a rough edge where someone presumably climbed through. Under the microscope, it reveals itself as wool, dyed a particular shade of blue-grey that narrows down its likely source to certain manufacturers. Dr. Chen consults reference books filled with fibre samples, comparing the evidence under different lighting conditions, measuring properties that Tom barely understands. 3 days later, she calls with results. The fibre matches a type of wool used primarily in manufacturing industrial coveralls, sold through workwear suppliers rather than regular clothing stores. It's not proof of anything by itself, but it's information that constrains possibilities. If Tom's suspect works in construction or a similar trade, this becomes corroborating evidence. If they work in an office and wear suits, it suggests either an accomplice or a completely different line of investigation. The Fingerprint Bureau operates in a different wing of the building, staffed by specialists who view the world through the lens of friction ridge patterns. They maintain files of known criminals organised by pattern type, allowing for comparison when prints from crime scenes are clear enough to be useful. The problem is that prints from actual crime scenes are often partial, smudged, or contaminated with multiple overlapping impressions that make analysis challenging. The fingerprint examiner working on Tom's burglary case A methodical man named Roberts, who apparently never hurries and never makes mistakes, has spent 2 days analysing prints lifted from a medicine cabinet. He's identified 3 distinct individuals: the homeowner, the homeowner's wife, and a third party whose prints don't match anyone in the known criminal files. This means either a first-time offender or someone who's been lucky enough not to be caught before. Roberts explains this in the tone of someone discussing weather patterns, showing Tom the comparison images that demonstrate his analysis. To Tom's untrained eye, the prints look nearly identical, but Roberts points out specific ridge characteristics: a bifurcation here, an ending ridge there, and a pattern of minutiae that he's counted and documented with the precision of an accountant balancing complicated ledgers. Blood analysis in the 1960s can determine type but not individual identity. When blood is found at a scene, analysts can tell you whether it's type A, B, AB, or O, which might help eliminate suspects but rarely provides definitive proof. The science exists in a space between useful and frustrating, capable of providing information that narrows possibilities without often delivering absolute certainty. Tom watches a blood analyst perform typing on a sample from an assault case, adding reagents that cause reactions visible under specific lighting conditions. The process is meticulous, repeated multiple times to verify results, and documented with the kind of detailed note-taking that would satisfy the most demanding auditor. The analyst explains that the sample is type A positive, which matches approximately 40% of the British population. Helpful for eliminating suspects who are type O or B, useless for proving anything about those who match. Ballistics analysis, used when firearms are involved, relies on the principle that every gun barrel leaves unique markings on bullets fired through it. The ballistics expert maintains a comparison microscope that allows side-by-side analysis of test-fired rounds and crime scene evidence, looking for matching striations that suggest a common origin. Tom has seen this expert spend entire afternoons examining a single bullet, making measurements, taking photographs, and building documentation that might eventually support testimony in court. What strikes Tom about all these specialists is their patience with uncertainty. They understand that forensic science in this era provides suggestions and probabilities rather than certainties, that their role is to narrow possibilities and support other evidence rather than solve cases single-handedly. They're comfortable saying possibly, likely, and consistent with, rather than definitely and certainly. This stands in interesting contrast to how forensic science is portrayed in popular culture, where laboratory analysis provides clear, definitive answers that immediately identify perpetrators. The real work is messier, more qualified, and infinitely more dependent on human judgment than the public generally understands. Tom has learned to work within these limitations, treating forensic evidence as one data source among many rather than the ultimate arbiter of truth. A fibre that matches the suspect's clothing is interesting, but it's not proof. Clothing fibres transfer easily, and could have arrived through innocent contact. Fingerprints are more definitive, but only if they're clear enough for confident matching, and found in locations that couldn't be explained by legitimate access. The real power of forensic science in this era isn't in providing smoking gun evidence, but in helping detectives focus their investigations, eliminating unlikely scenarios, and supporting theories that can be tested through traditional detective work. It's a support system for human judgment rather than a replacement for it. The discovery of a body in the canal near the industrial district creates ripples through the community that extend far beyond the immediate crime scene. This is the sort of event that transforms abstract concepts of danger into immediate personal fear, particularly when the victim is identified as a young woman who worked at the textile mill. Tom arrives at the scene in early morning fog, the kind of thick clinging mist that makes everything look slightly unreal. The canal path is lined with officers maintaining a perimeter, keeping away the curious crowd that has already gathered despite the early hour. News travels through working-class neighbourhoods with remarkable speed, passed along through networks of gossip and concern that operate far faster than official channels. The woman, identified from her handbag as Sarah Mitchell, appears to have been in the water for several hours. She's wearing a good coat, not expensive but well kept, and shoes suitable for walking home from work. There's no obvious sign of violence, though the pathologist who examines her at the scene notes bruising that could indicate either assault or the body being moved by water and debris. Tom's initial investigation focuses on establishing a timeline and last known movements. Sarah lived with her parents in a terraced house 15 minutes walk from the mill. She typically worked the evening shift, finishing at 10 o'clock, and walked home along well-lit streets that should have been reasonably safe. Her parents expected her home by 10:30 and called the police when she hadn't arrived by midnight. The mill manager, a harried man named Preston who clearly hasn't slept since hearing the news, confirms that Sarah left work at her normal time, wearing the coat and carrying the handbag that were found with her body. Several co-workers saw her leaving but didn't walk with her. She preferred to walk alone, apparently, enjoying the quiet after a day of industrial noise. The pathologist's preliminary examination suggests drowning as the likely cause of death, but there are questions that won't be answered until a full post-mortem examination. The bruises on her arms could indicate that someone grabbed her, or they could have been sustained when she fell into the water. There's no water in her lungs, which might suggest she was already dead when she entered the canal, or might simply mean the drowning was rapid enough not to leave that evidence. The community's reaction to Sarah's death reveals much about how 1960s Britain processes sudden tragedy. The mill stops production for a day as a mark of respect, which costs money the company can ill afford but feels necessary to honour a dead employee. The local church holds a special service, attended by people who haven't set foot in the building for months, but feel compelled to mark this particular loss. Sarah's Street organises a collection for her parents, gathering small donations that add up to enough for funeral expenses. But there's also fear, particularly among young women who work similar shifts and walk similar routes. The mill's evening shift sees several women who would normally walk home alone now travelling in groups, staying later than necessary to find companions. Parents who previously allowed their daughters independence now insist on escorts, or taxi services they can barely afford. Tom finds himself conducting dozens of interviews with people who didn't really know Sarah, but feel compelled to share whatever tangential information they possess. A shopkeeper mentions that Sarah sometimes stopped on her way home to buy cigarettes. A neighbour recalls seeing her the previous week carrying library books. The newsagent remembers that she had a sweet tooth and usually bought chocolate on Fridays. None of this is immediately useful for determining what happened, but Tom listens anyway, because sometimes useful information emerges from these seemingly irrelevant details, and because people need to feel they're contributing something in the face of senseless tragedy. The physical evidence is frustratingly limited. The canal path where Sarah presumably entered the water shows signs of a scuffle, disturbed gravel, a button that might have come from her coat, but also shows signs of regular foot traffic that makes distinguishing relevant evidence from background noise nearly impossible. There are no clear footprints, no conveniently dropped identification, and no witnesses who saw anything definitive. Tom's investigation expands to include known sex offenders in the area, men with previous convictions for assault or harassment of women, and anyone who might have reason to be on that canal path at that hour. Each interview follows a similar pattern, establishing alibi, gauging reactions, and looking for inconsistencies that might suggest involvement or knowledge. The breakthrough, when it comes, arrives through patient persistence rather than dramatic revelation. A factory worker who uses the canal path for his commute mentions, almost as an afterthought, that he saw someone running from the area around the time Sarah would have been there. Nothing particularly suspicious. People jog for exercise, but unusual enough at that hour to register. The running figure was male, wearing dark clothing and moving away from the city centre along the canal path. The witness didn't think much of it at the time, but hearing about Sarah's death made him wonder if it might be relevant. He can't provide a detailed description. It was dark, he was tired, he only glimpsed the figure briefly, but he remembers the general build and the direction of travel. This fragment of information, combined with patient checking of alibis and whereabouts, eventually leads Tom to David Porter, a foreman at a factory along the canal route. Porter's initial alibi, that he was home with his wife, falls apart when Tom establishes that his wife was actually visiting her mother that evening. Under gentle but persistent questioning, Porter's story develops inconsistencies that suggest both guilt and poor judgment about how to handle a crisis. The truth, when it finally emerges, is both tragic and mundane. Porter had been having an affair with Sarah, conducted in furtive meetings that both parties had hoped to keep secret. On the night in question, they argued near the canal. Porter wanted to end the relationship, and Sarah was upset and perhaps threatened to reveal it to his wife. In the heat of the argument, Porter grabbed Sarah's arm. She pulled away, lost her balance, and fell into the canal. Porter's subsequent actions, running from the scene, lying about his whereabouts, hoping the death would be ruled accidental, transformed a tragic accident into something requiring criminal prosecution. His panic and poor decision-making turned him from a man who made mistakes into someone facing charges of manslaughter and leaving the scene of death. The community's reaction to this resolution is complex. There's relief that a dangerous predator isn't stalking the streets, but also discomfort with the messiness of real human behaviour, the affair, the argument, the series of small decisions that cascade into tragedy. It's harder to process than a simple story of good versus evil would have been. Sarah's funeral is well attended, the service focusing on her life rather than her death. Her mother accepting condolences with the dignified grief of someone who understands that life sometimes makes no sense, and all you can do is endure. The mill returns to its normal operations, though Sarah's usual workstation remains empty for several weeks, before someone new is quietly assigned to it. Tom files his final reports with the satisfaction of having reached truth, if not justice in any simple sense. The case will proceed through the courts. Porter will likely face prison time, and the community will gradually absorb this tragedy into its collective memory. Another story told in hushed tones about why you should always be careful, why you should never trust anyone completely, and why life is fragile in ways we prefer not to acknowledge. Between the headline cases, the deaths, the serious assaults, the crimes that communities discuss for months afterward, lies the vast majority of police work, consisting of matters so ordinary they barely register as mysteries at all. Yet these cases, in their own way, reveal as much about human nature as any dramatic investigation. The matter of the missing garden gnomes, for instance, turns out to involve exactly the perpetrators Tom suspected from the beginning. A group of teenage boys who thought relocating ceramic dwarfs to increasingly absurd locations was the height of comedy. Tom finds the gnomes arranged in elaborate tableaux in an abandoned shed, some fishing in a dry fountain, others apparently engaged in a ceramic cricket match, all positioned with the kind of creative effort that suggests these boys might have actual talent if they could find legal outlets for it. Rather than formal charges, Tom arranges for the boys to return each gnome personally, apologising to the owners face-to-face, experiencing the discomfort of seeing the actual human consequences of what seemed like harmless pranks. Most of the gnome owners, confronted with sheepish teenagers rather than faceless criminals, respond with a mixture of relief and the kind of stern lectures that British people have perfected over generations. One elderly man whose prized gnome had gone missing tells the culprit about receiving it as a gift from his late wife, who had bought it on their honeymoon in Brighton 40 years ago. The boy, suddenly understanding that he hadn't just stolen a tacky garden ornament but a tangible connection to someone's personal history, looks genuinely stricken in a way that no formal punishment could have achieved. The shoplifting ring at Woolworths proves more complex and considerably sadder than simple teenage theft. The perpetrators are a mother and her two daughters, systematically stealing food, children's clothing and other necessities that they can't afford on the mother's meagre wages from her cleaning job. The father left 2 years ago and sends no support. The mother is too proud to apply for assistance, and convinced herself that stealing from a large company that wouldn't even notice was somehow less wrong than accepting charity. Tom finds himself navigating the gap between law and compassion, between what the rules require and what actual justice might look like. The store manager wants prosecution to deter others, which Tom understands from a business perspective, but finds deeply unsatisfying from a human one. He eventually brokers a compromise where the mother agrees to repay the stolen value through additional cleaning work and to apply for the social assistance she's entitled to, while the store agrees not to press charges. It's not elegant, and it probably wouldn't satisfy anyone looking for clear moral lines. But it addresses the actual problem, a struggling family's desperate attempt to survive, rather than just punishing the symptom. Tom drives the mother to the social services office himself, helping her navigate forms that seem deliberately designed to confuse and humiliate, and feels more satisfaction from this than from many more celebrated investigative successes. The threatening letters to the headmaster are eventually traced to a former janitor who was dismissed for drinking on the job and nursed his grievance into an elaborate revenge fantasy. The man turns out to be more pitiable than frightening, living alone in a bedsit, consuming too much cheap whiskey, clinging to imagined slights because they give shape to a life that has otherwise lost meaning. Tom arranges for him to receive a caution rather than prosecution, with the understanding that he'll seek help for his drinking and stay away from the school. These cases don't make the newspapers or feature in annual crime statistics as anything more than numbers, but they consume the majority of Tom's time and energy, each one requiring the same patient attention to detail, the same careful gathering of evidence, and the same navigation of human complexity that characterises detective work regardless of the crime's severity. If you were to chart Tom's work week on a graph, it would show a rhythm that cycles between intense focus and administrative routine, between human interaction and solitary contemplation, and between the immediate demands of active cases and the patient accumulation of knowledge that makes future investigations possible. Monday mornings typically begin with the weekend's accumulated incidents. Domestic disputes that escalated after Saturday night drinking, burglaries committed when families were out visiting relatives, and traffic accidents involving drivers who misjudged their capacity to handle Sunday lunch followed by Sunday driving. Tom reviews reports filed by weekend duty officers, deciding which require his attention and which can be handled by uniformed constables. The paperwork is relentless and multiplying. Each investigation generates reports that must be typed, filed, and cross-referenced. Witness statements require careful transcription and verification. Evidence must be logged, stored, and tracked through chains of custody that will withstand court scrutiny. Tom spends hours at his typewriter, hunting and pecking his way through formal language that transforms human drama into bureaucratic prose. Tuesday and Wednesday often involve court appearances for cases that have worked their way through the judicial system. Tom sits in witness boxes, swearing on Bibles to tell the truth, then answering questions from barristers who treat cross-examination like a competitive sport. He's learned to answer precisely what's asked without volunteering additional information, to acknowledge uncertainty when he's uncertain, and to present findings in language that juries can understand without feeling patronised. The courts themselves are exercises in tradition and formality. Judges in wigs and robes, barristers in their own wigs addressing each other with elaborate courtesy, and a ceremonial dignity that some find reassuring and others find absurd. Tom appreciates the theatre of it, understanding that justice requires not just correct outcomes, but visible processes that inspire public confidence. Thursdays are often dedicated to community policing, visiting schools to talk about safety and law, attending neighbourhood meetings where residents raise concerns about parking and noise, and maintaining the relationships that make his job possible. Tom speaks to a group of primary school children about stranger danger and road safety, simplifying complex concepts into memorable rules while trying not to terrify them about the world they live in. The children ask questions with the unself-conscious directness that adults have learned to suppress. Have you ever arrested anyone? Yes. Have you ever been scared? Yes. Do you carry a gun? No, British police officers generally don't. Have you ever met the Queen? No, but I met the Mayor once, which seemed impressive at the time. Friday afternoons often involve reviewing active cases with other detectives, sharing information and theories in informal sessions that generate more useful insights than formal briefings. These discussions range across topics: patterns in recent burglaries, concerns about a particular individual's behaviour, and techniques for getting reluctant witnesses to cooperate. The accumulated wisdom of experienced officers, passed along through conversation rather than written procedure, forms an invisible curriculum that new detectives absorb through participation. Tom shares his theory about burglaries tending to cluster near major roads where thieves can make quick escapes, while Detective Sergeant Williams counters that proximity to railway stations seems equally predictive. Neither can prove their hypothesis definitively, but the discussion sharpens everyone's attention to these factors when examining new cases. The evenings that Tom doesn't spend reviewing case files are often dedicated to reading, not just detective manuals and legal updates, but psychology, sociology, and anything that helps him understand why people do what they do. He's currently working through a book about adolescent development, trying to understand the teenage mind well enough to predict when minor misbehaviour might escalate into serious trouble. His wife occasionally asks if he ever stops being a detective, and the honest answer is probably no. He notices things constantly. The man at the bus stop who's watching people too intently, the shop window that has the same display week after week, suggesting the business might be struggling, and patterns in neighbourhood foot traffic that might indicate nothing, or might indicate something worth remembering. This constant awareness is both the strength and burden of long-term police work. You become very good at reading environments and people, noticing discordances and anomalies, but you also lose the ability to simply exist in spaces without analysing them. Every social gathering includes mental notes about who's drinking more than usual, whose marriage seems under strain, and which teenagers are gravitating toward trouble. Tom's desk drawer contains the essential equipment of 1960s detective work, a collection that would seem quaintly inadequate to modern investigators, but represents the best available technology of its time. There's a magnifying glass, genuinely useful for examining documents and small pieces of evidence, a measuring tape for documenting crime scenes, a camera, though the good cameras are kept in the evidence room and signed out when needed, several notebooks in various stages of completion, an address book containing contact information for informants, experts, and useful officials across the region. The police radio system, introduced during the 1950s and still being expanded, allows limited communication with patrol cars, but requires speaking in codes and dealing with interference that sometimes makes conversations nearly unintelligible. Officers learn to repeat information, confirm understanding, and accept that some messages will need to be delivered through other means. The squelch and crackle of radio transmission becomes background noise, occasionally punctuated by urgent calls that send everyone scrambling. The patrol cars themselves are mostly small British saloons, Morris Minors, Ford Anglias, and occasionally a larger rover for senior officers. They're not particularly fast or powerful, but they're economical and can navigate narrow British streets that would challenge American-style police cruisers. Each car contains basic emergency equipment, a first aid kit, a blanket, a torch that always seems to have batteries that are nearly dead, and a collection of forms for documenting various types of incidents. Photography at crime scenes requires actual skill and judgment. The photographer must decide which angles matter, how to light scenes in buildings without proper illumination, and how to capture both overview shots that show context and detail shots that document specific evidence. There's no instant review, no digital deletion of failed attempts. Each photograph consumes film that must be carefully managed, developed, and archived. The evidence room in the station basement is a fascinating archaeology of recent crime. Boxes containing clothing from assaults, bags of items stolen and recovered, weapons ranging from knives to improvised clubs, and documents photocopied for investigative purposes. Each item is tagged with case numbers and dates, creating a physical database that requires careful organisation and occasional purges when storage space becomes critical. Tom sometimes visits this room just to refresh his memory about cases, pulling files and examining evidence that didn't quite solve mysteries, but remains available if new information emerges. The unsolved cases bother him more than he admits. Files that represent questions without answers, victims without justice, and families without closure. The interview techniques available to detectives in this era rely entirely on human psychology, rather than technological aids. There's no recording equipment to capture exact words, and no video to document body language and emotional reactions. Instead, detectives must remember, take notes, and work with witnesses who may be honest but unreliable, dishonest but revealing, or simply confused about events that happened quickly in stressful circumstances. Tom has developed a particular approach that combines patience with strategic persistence. He doesn't typically confront suspects with aggressive questioning or dramatic accusations. Instead, he presents information gradually, letting people construct their own narratives, noting where those narratives conflict with established facts. Many criminals, he's learned, want to talk about their crimes, not to confess necessarily, but to explain, justify, or relive significant experiences. The gap between what someone says and what they reveal through omission, hesitation, or overemphasis often tells Tom more than direct statements. A suspect who provides an extremely detailed alibi for a specific hour, but remains vague about the surrounding time, may be constructing fiction for the period that matters, while relying on memory for less critical moments. Someone who answers questions about their relationship with a victim with unexpected anger or defensiveness may be revealing more than they intend. As the 1960s progress toward their conclusion, Tom increasingly finds himself training younger detectives who will carry police work into the next decade and beyond. These newer officers have different backgrounds, some university educated, bringing academic knowledge to complement practical training, others from working class neighbourhoods, bringing street wisdom and cultural fluency that help navigate community relationships. Detective Constable Janet Morrison represents the slowly increasing presence of women in investigative roles, though she still faces assumptions and barriers that male colleagues don't encounter. Tom makes a point of assigning her cases based on skill rather than gender. Watching her develop the particular combination of persistence and empathy that characterises effective detective work. She handles interviews with assault victims with a sensitivity that some male officers struggle to achieve, but also demonstrates the kind of analytical rigour that solves complex cases. The forensic techniques that Tom learned to use are evolving, becoming more sophisticated and more reliable. Blood typing is being supplemented by enzyme analysis that can provide additional identifying information. Fingerprint classification systems are being refined and expanded. New chemical tests for gunshot residue and trace evidence are being developed in laboratories that are becoming increasingly professionalised. Tom attends workshops on these emerging techniques, sitting in rooms with other middle-aged detectives learning about scientific advances that would have seemed like fantasy when they began their careers. The workshops are taught by younger scientists who treat established investigators with the kind of careful respect you show to people who might feel threatened by change. And Tom appreciates both their knowledge and their diplomatic handling of egos. The social changes sweeping through 1960s Britain are creating new challenges for police work. Drug use, previously limited to specific subcultures, is spreading among young people experimenting with marijuana and increasingly with harder substances. The sexual revolution is complicating traditional approaches to morality crimes. Immigration is diversifying communities in ways that require cultural sensitivity and language skills that older officers often lack. Tom finds himself navigating these changes with mixed feelings. Some shifts seem obviously positive, the increasing unwillingness to tolerate domestic violence, for instance, or the growing recognition that criminal justice should serve victims rather than simply punish offenders. Other changes feel more ambiguous, representing the loss of shared social norms that made community policing simpler, even if those norms weren't always just or fair. The threatening letters to the headmaster, the shoplifting family, the garden gnome thieves, all these cases reveal a Britain in transition, caught between traditional values and emerging alternatives, between the tight-knit communities of the past and the more individualistic society being born. Tom's role increasingly involves mediating these tensions, finding justice that serves both law and human complexity. His reputation within the force has evolved over decades from promising newcomer to reliable veteran to unofficial mentor. Younger detectives seek his advice not just about specific cases, but about career decisions, ethical dilemmas, and the challenge of maintaining professional objectivity while remaining emotionally available to victims who need compassion. Tom answers these questions as honestly as he can, acknowledging that experience provides perspective rather than certainty, and that every detective must ultimately find their own path through moral complexity. The regular Friday evening gathering at the pub near the station, an informal tradition, involving whoever finishes their shift around the same time, provides space for this mentoring to happen naturally. Over pints of bitter and packets of crisps, detectives trade stories, discuss cases they can legally discuss, and gradually transmit the accumulated wisdom that makes police work something more than just following procedures. Tom shares the story of his first major investigation, a fatal hit and run that he solved through patient door knocking and attention to vehicle damage that most people wouldn't have noticed. The lesson isn't about the specific techniques, but about the value of thorough, unglamorous work that produces results through accumulation rather than inspiration. Young detectives nodding over their drinks are absorbing not just methods, but attitudes and approaches to work that will shape their careers for decades. The Britain that Tom polices is a country of specific textures and rhythms that will largely disappear by the next decade. Shops close at 5:30 and remain firmly shut on Sundays, creating weekly cycles of activity and rest that structure community life. Pubs serve as social centres where neighbourhood business gets conducted, relationships form and dissolve, and the informal news network that predates mass media continues to flourish. The high street near the station contains a butcher, a baker, a greengrocer, a chemist, and a Woolworths that serves as a department store for people who can't afford actual department stores. Tom knows the proprietors of most of these establishments, not through formal community policing, but through the simple fact of working in the same area for years, becoming a familiar figure whose presence provides reassurance. The butcher, a man named Harris, who wears a striped apron spotted with blood in ways that would probably violate modern health codes, occasionally mentions customers whose behaviour strikes him as odd. Not criminal, necessarily, but notable. Someone buying unusual quantities of meat, perhaps, or asking strange questions about cutting techniques. These observations rarely lead anywhere, but they form part of the texture of information that Tom accumulates without conscious effort. The chemist is more useful from an investigative perspective, since poison and pharmaceutical theft occasionally feature in cases. The chemist maintains meticulous records of controlled substance prescriptions, noting any patterns that might suggest doctor shopping or forged prescriptions. Tom has solved 2 separate cases involving prescription fraud through information provided by this methodical, slightly fussy man who takes his regulatory responsibilities seriously. The tea rooms where Tom sometimes conducts informal interviews provide neutral territory, where witnesses feel less intimidated than they would at the police station. Over tea and biscuits served on mismatched china, people share information they might withhold in more formal settings, perhaps because the domestic setting makes conversation feel social rather than investigative. Tom has learned to read the specific vocabulary of British class and region, understanding that how someone speaks often tells you as much about their background as what they say. A particular accent suggests specific neighbourhoods, certain word choices indicate education level and social class, and patterns of speech reveal whether someone is local or from elsewhere. This isn't profiling in any prejudicial sense, but rather the kind of contextual understanding that comes from decades of listening carefully. The telephone in Tom's office rings with a particular bell tone that's unique to the station's internal system, different from external calls in ways that allow him to prepare mentally for different types of conversations. Internal calls usually mean assignments or updates from other officers. External calls might be witnesses, victims, informants, or occasionally criminals who've decided to turn themselves in through this specific detective rather than dealing with the front desk. Tom's handwriting in his notebooks has evolved over the years into a personal script that's efficient rather than elegant, combining abbreviations with symbols that would be nearly meaningless to anyone else. The notebooks themselves become physical repositories of investigations, occasionally consulted years later when old cases develop new leads, or when patterns emerge that connect seemingly unrelated incidents. As Tom approaches the end of his career, though he'll work several more years before retirement, he finds himself reflecting on what justice actually means in practice, rather than theory. The law provides frameworks and procedures, but individual cases rarely fit neatly into legal categories. Real human behaviour is messier, more complicated, and more driven by circumstance and emotion than criminal codes acknowledge. The theft by the struggling mother, for instance, was clearly illegal, but was it truly criminal in the moral sense? The law says yes, but Tom's conscience remains uncertain. He followed procedure, sort of, while also finding a solution that addressed underlying problems rather than just punishing symptoms. Whether this represents good policing or overstepping his authority depends on whose perspective you adopt. The accidental death by the canal, followed by a panicked cover-up, transformed a tragic accident into criminal liability through David Porter's subsequent choices. Was justice served by his prosecution? Sarah's mother seemed to think so, but her daughter remained dead regardless of legal outcomes. The community received closure, perhaps, though the messy truth satisfied nobody's desire for simple morality. Even the garden gnome theft required judgments about appropriate responses. Formal prosecution would have given those boys criminal records for essentially stupid pranks, potentially affecting their future employment and educational opportunities. The informal resolution Tom arranged probably taught them more useful lessons while avoiding disproportionate consequences. But it also meant different treatment based on Tom's judgment rather than consistent application of law. These ambiguities used to bother Tom more than they do now. Experience has taught him that justice is a direction you aim toward rather than a destination you reach. That most cases involve balancing competing goods rather than choosing between obvious right and wrong. The law provides useful guardrails, but the space between those guardrails requires human judgment that can't be reduced to procedure. The forensic science he's seen develop during his career represents humanity's attempt to make justice more objective, to replace subjective judgment with measurable facts. Blood types, fingerprints, and fibre analysis, all these reduce uncertainty and constrain possibilities. But they don't eliminate the need for human interpretation, for understanding context and motivation, or for distinguishing between legal guilt and moral culpability. Tom has prosecuted people he personally liked and felt sympathy for, because they broke laws that serve important social purposes regardless of individual circumstances. He's also declined to prosecute people who were technically guilty, but whose prosecution would serve no useful purpose. These decisions haunt him sometimes, late at night when sleep won't come, and he reviews choices that seemed clear at the time, but look more ambiguous in retrospect. The victims he's served, some grateful, some disappointed by outcomes they couldn't control, some angry that justice moved too slowly or incompletely, remind him that police work affects real lives in ways that paperwork and procedures can obscure. A solved case might be a satisfying checkmark on his annual review, but for the victim, it's the difference between closure and endless wondering, between vindication and abandonment. As you prepare for deep sleep, or if you are already there, consider the detectives who work tonight in cities across Britain and beyond. People conducting investigations with tools that would astound Tom's generation, solving crimes through DNA analysis and digital forensics that seem like magic compared to 1960s technology. Yet the fundamental work remains unchanged. Paying attention, asking questions, and accumulating small facts into larger truths. The mysteries Tom investigated weren't always dramatic or violent. Many involved property rather than persons, mistakes rather than malice, and human weakness rather than calculated evil. But each one mattered to someone. The elderly man whose gnome connected him to his late wife, the mother struggling to feed her children, the headmaster receiving anonymous threats, and Sarah Mitchell's parents seeking understanding if not comfort. Detective work in the 1960s existed in a particular historical moment, after the introduction of scientific crime solving but before its full flowering, in communities cohesive enough to notice anomalies, but diverse enough to generate friction, using technology that was revolutionary for its time, but primitive by our standards. Tom and his colleagues navigated this landscape with tools both crude and sophisticated, relying on human observation, supplemented by laboratory analysis and community relationships enhanced by careful record keeping. The Britain they policed is largely gone now, replaced by something faster, more connected, and less constrained by tradition and social hierarchies. The high streets where Tom knew every shopkeeper have been transformed by chain stores and online shopping. The close-knit neighbourhoods where everyone knew everyone else's business have fragmented into more anonymous patterns of living. The deference to authority that made police work simpler has been replaced by healthier skepticism that makes it more accountable. But human nature, the mix of decency and selfishness, courage and fear, honesty and deception, remains remarkably constant across generations. People still steal when desperate or opportunistic, still harm each other through passion or calculation, and still make terrible decisions that cascade into tragedy. And other people still dedicate their careers to sorting through these failures, seeking truth and some approximation of justice. Tom's legacy isn't measured in dramatic cases or headlines, but in the steady accumulation of small successes, crimes solved, communities served, younger officers trained, and victims given whatever closure the law and human limitation allow. His career represents thousands of hours spent listening, observing, documenting and testifying, always working within a system that's imperfect, but striving toward ideals that justify the effort. The quiet mysteries of 1960s Britain, garden gnomes and threatening letters, accidental deaths and opportunistic thefts, reveal a society in transition, struggling to maintain order while navigating rapid change. Tom's generation of detectives served as guides through this transition, applying old wisdom to new challenges, adapting traditional methods to emerging circumstances, and building bridges between the Britain that was and the Britain becoming. As you drift towards sleep, you might imagine Tom in his later years, retired but still alert to the world around him, still noticing discrepancies and anomalies through a habit too deeply ingrained to abandon. Perhaps he volunteers with youth programs, sharing stories about justice and consequences. Perhaps he simply tends his garden, finding peace in growing things rather than hunting people. Perhaps he occasionally visits the old station, now updated with computers and modern technology, and marvels at how much has changed while recognising how much remains the same. The mysteries continue in every era and every place where humans live together in communities. The tools for solving them evolve, the social contexts shift, but the fundamental work endures. Paying attention to what others miss, asking questions until truth emerges, seeking justice in an imperfect world that nonetheless demands the effort. Sleep well, knowing that in the long tradition of people dedicated to that work, you've just spent time with one detective's ordinary career in an extraordinary moment of British history. Tom Henley isn't famous and won't be remembered in history books, but represents thousands of professionals who served quietly and competently, with more dedication than glory, and perhaps that's the most important mystery solved tonight. That ordinary work, done with care and persistence, creates the foundation of civilization itself. The dramatic cases capture attention, but it's the patient, unglamorous resolution of everyday mysteries that actually holds communities together. Imagine living in a world where nobody really agreed on how to figure out what was true. Not just disagreeing about the facts, that happens all the time, but fundamentally disagreeing about the process itself. Should you trust your senses, or are they lying to you? Should you rely on logic and mathematics, or should you look at the actual world around you? Can you even trust that the world around you is real? This was Greece in the 5th century BCE, and it was having something like an intellectual identity crisis. For most of human history, people had explained the world through stories about gods and heroes. Thunder wasn't a meteorological phenomenon, it was Zeus having a bad day. Disease wasn't about germs and immune systems, it was divine punishment, or maybe a curse from that neighbour who gave you the evil eye last Tuesday. But then something remarkable happened. A group of people in the Greek world started asking a revolutionary question. What if we could understand the world without resorting to supernatural explanations? What if there were natural causes for natural effects? What if, instead of just accepting that things happen because the gods will it, we could actually figure out how the world works? These early thinkers, we call them the pre-Socratics because they came before Socrates, which is a bit like calling everyone who lived before Shakespeare pre-Shakespeareans, came up with wildly different theories. Thales thought everything was made of water. Heraclitus believed everything was constantly changing. Like a river you can never step in twice. Parmenides argued the opposite, that change was an illusion and reality was actually perfectly still and unchanging. You can imagine how confusing this must have been for regular people trying to live their lives. One philosopher tells you everything is water, another says everything is fire, and a third insists that motion is impossible, and you're not really walking to the market. You just think you are. It was like having too many fortune cookies with contradictory advice, except these philosophers were dead serious and would debate these points for hours. Then came Socrates, wandering around Athens like that uncle who asks uncomfortable questions at family dinners. Socrates didn't claim to know anything. In fact, his whole thing was admitting he knew nothing, which somehow made him wiser than everyone else. His method was to ask questions until people realised they didn't actually understand the things they thought they understood. This made him simultaneously the most important philosopher in Athens and probably the most annoying person at parties. Socrates had a brilliant student named Plato who took his teacher's question-asking method and built an entire philosophical system around it. Plato believed that the world we see around us is just shadows on a cave wall, imperfect copies of perfect forms that exist in some higher realm. That chair you're sitting on? It's just a flawed imitation of the perfect form of chairness that exists in the realm of forms. Plato's philosophy was beautiful, elegant, and deeply mathematical. It appealed to people who like their truth pure, abstract, and divorced from the messy complications of everyday reality. The physical world, in Plato's view, was just a distraction from true knowledge, which could only be found through pure reason and contemplation. This was the intellectual world into which Aristotle would be born, a world where philosophers disagreed about everything, where the relationship between thought and reality was unclear, and where nobody had quite figured out how to systematically study the natural world. It was like the internet before search engines or a library where all the books were filed randomly, and nobody could agree on what counts as a book. The Greeks had made tremendous progress in mathematics, logic, and abstract thinking. What they needed was someone who could take all these brilliant ideas and connect them to the actual observable world. They needed someone who could bridge the gap between pure philosophy and empirical observation, between what we can think and what we can see. They were about to get exactly that person, though he would arrive from an unexpected place, not from Athens itself, but from the wild northern frontier of the Greek world. In 384 BCE, in a small town called Stagira on the Macedonian peninsula, a child was born to a family that straddled two worlds. His name was Aristotle, Aristoteles in Greek, which means something like the best purpose or excellent end, a name that turned out to be remarkably prophetic, even if his parents couldn't have known it at the time. Aristotle's father, Nicomachus, was the court physician to the Macedonian king. This was no small thing. Imagine being the personal doctor to royalty in an era when medicine was part science, part guesswork, and part hoping really hard that your treatments worked before the patient died. Nicomachus apparently did well at it, which suggests he had a combination of observational skills, empirical knowledge, and the bedside manner necessary to keep nervous monarchs calm. Growing up in a physician's household meant young Aristotle was exposed to a very different way of thinking than most Greek philosophers of his time. While Plato and his students in Athens were debating abstract forms and mathematical perfection, Aristotle was probably watching his father dissect fish, examine symptoms, and make careful notes about which treatments worked and which ones didn't. This early exposure to empirical observation, to the idea that you learn by looking, touching, measuring, and recording, would shape everything Aristotle would later do. Medicine in ancient Greece wasn't about applying perfect theoretical principles. It was about noticing patterns, testing treatments, and learning from experience. It was messy, practical, and grounded in the physical world. Tragically, both of Aristotle's parents died when he was young, probably around 10 years old. This must have been devastating for the boy, but it also set in motion events that would change the course of intellectual history. His guardian, a man named Proxenus, took responsibility for the orphaned child and continued his education. Young Aristotle grew up in Macedonia, which was considered the backwoods of the Greek world. Athenians looked down on Macedonians the way sophisticated urbanites have always looked down on rural populations. They saw them as rough, unsophisticated, and not quite civilized. The Macedonian accent was apparently a source of mockery in Athens, like speaking with a strong regional accent in a place that prides itself on its sophistication. But being from the provinces gave Aristotle something valuable, a certain independence from Athenian intellectual fashion. He wasn't raised in the echo chamber of elite Athenian thought. He'd seen how people lived in different places, under different systems. He'd been exposed to the practical, empirical approach of medicine rather than just the abstract reasoning of philosophy. When Aristotle was 17, an age when most of us were trying to figure out who we were and what we wanted to do with our lives, his guardian made a decision that would alter the course of philosophy forever. He sent the young man to Athens to study at Plato's Academy, the most prestigious philosophical school in the Greek world. Imagine being a teenager from a small provincial town, arriving in Athens, the intellectual and cultural capital of Greece. It would be like moving from a rural town to the most exciting city you can think of, except instead of worrying about where the good coffee shops are, you're suddenly surrounded by the greatest minds of the ancient world debating questions about the nature of reality. Athens in the 360s BCE was extraordinary. It was recovering from the devastating Peloponnesian War, but still retained its status as the centre of Greek intellectual life. The agora, the marketplace, wasn't just where people bought vegetables and sandals. It was where philosophers held forth, where politicians debated, and where ideas collided and combined in fascinating ways. Plato's Academy sat just outside the city, walls, in a grove sacred to the hero Academus, which is where we get the word academy. It wasn't a school in the way we think of schools today, with classrooms and curricula and final exams. It was more like an advanced research institute crossed with a philosophical monastery, where brilliant people gathered to think, debate, and pursue knowledge for its own sake. Young Aristotle, arriving from Macedonia with his provincial accent and his physician father's emphasis on observation, must have seemed a bit odd to the other students. But he had something they lacked, a mind that could absorb and synthesize information like a sponge absorbing water. Within a short time, it became clear that this young man from the provinces was something special. You know how in university some students just coast through, doing the minimum required to get by, while others become completely absorbed in their studies to the point where they forget to eat or sleep? Aristotle was definitely the second type, except more so. He didn't just study at Plato's Academy. He became its most brilliant and ultimately most independent-minded student. Plato apparently called him the mind of the school, which is high praise from someone who didn't hand out compliments lightly. But Plato also called him the foal or the reader, nicknames that suggest Aristotle was always reading, always learning, always consuming knowledge with an appetite that probably worried the Academy's librarians about the survival of their scrolls. Aristotle spent 20 years at the Academy from age 17 to 37. That's longer than many people spend in their entire educational career today. But ancient philosophical education wasn't like modern university, where you take classes, write papers, and graduate after 4 years. It was more like a lifelong apprenticeship in thinking itself. During these years, Aristotle absorbed everything Plato had to teach. He learned about the forms, about the immortality of the soul, and about mathematics as the key to understanding reality. He learned Socrates' method of questioning, Plato's theory of knowledge, and the elaborate philosophical system that Plato had built over his lifetime. But something interesting was happening as Aristotle learned. He was also beginning to disagree, not in small ways, but fundamentally. While Plato looked at a tree and saw an imperfect copy of the form of treeness existing in some perfect realm, Aristotle looked at a tree and thought, this tree right here is real and worth studying for itself. This might not sound like a revolutionary insight, but it was. Plato's philosophy essentially said that the physical world was less real, less important, and less worthy of study than the abstract realm of forms. Aristotle was starting to think the opposite, that you couldn't understand anything without careful study of actual physical things. Imagine being a student whose growing convictions directly contradict your revered teacher's fundamental beliefs. It must have created considerable tension. Plato had built his entire philosophical system on the idea that true knowledge comes from reason alone, that the senses deceive us, and that the physical world is just shadows on a cave wall. And here was his best student, increasingly convinced that observation and empirical study were essential to understanding anything. Aristotle began writing during this period, though most of his early works are lost. What we do know is that he was developing his own philosophical positions, often in direct contradiction to Plato's teachings. There's a famous saying attributed to Aristotle: "Plato is dear to me, but dearer still is truth." Whether he actually said this or not, it captures his attitude. Loyalty to his teacher, yes, but greater loyalty to following arguments wherever they led. The academy during these years was like an intellectual pressure cooker. Students and teachers would debate for hours, testing ideas against each other, looking for weaknesses in arguments, and trying to build philosophical systems that could withstand scrutiny. It was mentally exhausting and exhilarating in equal measure. Aristotle distinguished himself not just by his intelligence, but by the breadth of his interests. While other students might focus narrowly on one area of philosophy, Aristotle seemed interested in everything. Ethics? Sure. Politics? Absolutely. The natural world? Fascinating. Poetry and drama? Why not? He was developing into what we might call a polymath, someone whose curiosity encompassed the entirety of human knowledge. But there were social challenges too. Aristotle's provincial background and his Macedonian connections made him something of an outsider in Athenian society. Athens and Macedonia had complicated relations, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, always regarding each other with a mixture of respect and suspicion. Being Macedonian in Athens was like being permanently foreign, never quite fitting in no matter how long you stayed. In 347 BCE, after 2 decades at the academy, Plato died. He was over 80 years old and had shaped Western philosophy more profoundly than perhaps any single person before or since. His death left a vacancy at the head of the academy, and many people, probably including Aristotle himself, expected that the brilliant student would succeed his master. But that's not what happened. The academy's leadership chose Plato's nephew Speusippus instead. We can't know exactly why. Maybe Aristotle's disagreements with Platonic doctrine were already too well known. Maybe his Macedonian background worked against him. Or maybe there were personal factors we'll never understand. Whatever the reason, Aristotle found himself passed over for the position he'd spent 20 years preparing for. So Aristotle did what any reasonable person would do when faced with professional disappointment. He left Athens entirely and began an entirely new chapter of his life. He was 37 years old, intellectually mature and ready to chart his own course. What he didn't know was that his best work still lay ahead of him. Leaving Athens after 20 years must have felt like leaving home, even if that home had never quite accepted you as family. Aristotle travelled to Assos, a small city on the coast of what's now Turkey, where a former fellow student named Hermias ruled as a local tyrant. Though tyrant in Greek didn't necessarily mean bad ruler, just sole ruler, which shows you how differently ancient Greeks thought about political terminology. Assos gave Aristotle something he'd never really had before: freedom to pursue his own philosophical vision without being in Plato's shadow. He established a small philosophical school, gathered students, and began to seriously work out his own ideas. It was like being a musician who'd apprenticed with a master for 20 years and was finally ready to compose their own music. But Assos also gave Aristotle something unexpected: love. He married Pythias, who was either Hermias' daughter or niece. Sources disagree, and ancient family trees are notoriously difficult to untangle. What we do know is that Aristotle seems to have genuinely loved her, which is worth noting in a time when philosophical marriages were often more about alliances than affection. The couple had a daughter, also named Pythias. Aristotle would later write about marriage and family life with the kind of nuanced understanding that suggests his own experience informed his philosophy. He understood that human flourishing wasn't just about abstract contemplation. It was also about relationships, love, and the texture of daily life. During his time in Assos and later on the nearby island of Lesbos, Aristotle began the biological, research that would occupy him for much of his life. The Aegean coast was perfect for this: tide pools full of sea creatures, forests with diverse plant life, and marine environments that changed with the seasons. It was a living laboratory, and Aristotle approached it with the systematic curiosity he'd inherited from his physician father. He would wade into tide pools, examining starfish and sea urchins with the focus of a modern marine biologist. He dissected squid, studied dolphins, and observed how different fish species spawned. He collected plants, noted their characteristics, and tried to understand the patterns that connected different forms of life. It was hands-on, empirical work that would have made Plato deeply uncomfortable. All this focus on the physical world, this belief that truth could be found by getting your feet wet and your hands dirty. Aristotle was developing a method that combined observation with logical analysis. He would look at many examples of something, say different types of fish, notice their similarities and differences, and then try to work out the principles that explain these patterns. It was the beginning of what we now call the scientific method, though Aristotle would have just called it investigating nature. His biological observations were remarkably accurate. He correctly described the development of chick embryos inside eggs, noted that whales and dolphins are mammals rather than fish, and documented hundreds of species with precision that wouldn't be matched until centuries later. Some of his observations were so detailed that modern biologists who've gone back to check have found them essentially correct. But then, in 343 BCE, Aristotle received an invitation that would change his life again. Philip II of Macedonia, remember that kingdom in the north that sophisticated Athenians looked down on, had a teenage son who needed a tutor. The son's name was Alexander, and Philip was willing to pay handsomely for the best education money could buy. For Aristotle, this was both an opportunity and a homecoming. He would be returning to Macedonia, the land of his childhood, but now as a distinguished philosopher rather than an orphaned boy. More importantly, he would have the chance to shape the mind of a young prince who might someday rule Macedonia. Neither Philip nor Aristotle could have imagined that this teenage student would become Alexander the Great, conqueror of the Persian Empire and creator of an empire stretching from Greece to India. But for 3 years, in a quiet grove in Macedonia, one of history's greatest minds taught one of history's greatest conquerors. Picture this. You're Aristotle, a 40-year-old philosopher who spent your entire adult life studying everything from ethics to zoology, and now you've been hired to teach a headstrong, ambitious 13-year-old prince who's already been training with weapons and horses, who's grown up hearing stories of military glory, and who shows about as much interest in philosophical contemplation as most teenagers show in eating vegetables. The tutoring took place at Mysa, a village in Macedonia, where Philip had established something like a private school for Alexander and a few select companions. It was quieter than the royal court, which was probably essential for any serious studying, and it had the kind of natural surroundings that Aristotle loved for observing and collecting specimens. What did Aristotle teach a future world conqueror? We know he introduced Alexander to Homer's Iliad, which became the prince's favourite book. Alexander reportedly slept with a copy under his pillow, along with a dagger, which tells you something about his priorities. The Iliad wasn't just entertainment, it was a manual on honour, glory, and what it meant to be a hero in the Greek tradition. But Aristotle taught more than literature. He introduced Alexander to philosophy, science, medicine, and the Greek ideal of education as forming the complete person, body, mind, and character all developed in harmony. He encouraged the young prince's curiosity about the natural world, his interest in different cultures, and his appreciation for knowledge of all kinds. There's a wonderful image of Aristotle and his teenage students, Alexander and his companions, walking through the countryside, discussing philosophy while observing plants and animals. It combines everything Aristotle loved: intellectual conversation, empirical observation, and the belief that education happens best when you're actively engaged with the world rather than locked in a classroom. Did Aristotle's teaching actually influence the man Alexander became? It's hard to say for certain. Alexander the Conqueror, who swept across Asia, wasn't exactly practicing the moderate contemplative life that Aristotle advocated in his Ethics. He was more interested in military glory than philosophical wisdom, more concerned with conquest than with the careful observation of nature. But there are hints of Aristotle's influence. Alexander founded cities throughout his empire and filled them with Greek culture, libraries, theatres, and schools. He collected botanical and zoological specimens during his campaigns and sent them back to Aristotle, supporting his former teacher's scientific research. He showed curiosity about the peoples he conquered, trying to understand their customs and incorporate them into his empire rather than simply destroying them. Their relationship was complicated, like many relationships between teachers and students, who've gone in different directions. Later, when Alexander executed Aristotle's nephew Callisthenes for alleged treason, it created a rift between them. Aristotle had shown Alexander how to think, But he couldn't control what the young man thought about or what he chose to do with his power. After 3 years, when Alexander was 16, Philip decided his son was ready for more practical education, namely learning to be a warrior and leader. Aristotle's job was done. The tutor and his student would go their separate ways, one to conquer the known world, the other to found a school and revolutionize human understanding. In 335 BCE, at age 49, Aristotle returned to Athens. Alexander was now king, Philip had been assassinated, and beginning his conquest of Persia. Athens was nervous about Macedonia's growing power, but Aristotle's connection to the Macedonian court actually gave him resources and protection that few other philosophers enjoyed. It was time for Aristotle to do what he'd been preparing for his entire adult life: establish his own school, develop his own philosophical system, and teach students according to his own vision rather than Plato's. The intellectual adventure was about to enter its most productive phase. When Aristotle returned to Athens in 335 BCE, he couldn't return to Plato's academy. It had its own leadership and its own Platonic tradition that Aristotle had largely rejected. So he did what any philosopher with ambition and resources would do. He founded his own school. The Lyceum, named after the nearby temple of Apollo Lyceus, became Aristotle's intellectual home for the next 12 years. Located in a grove just outside Athens, it was similar to the academy in being a place where philosophers gathered to study, debate, and pursue knowledge. But in crucial ways, it was completely different. For one thing, the Lyceum was far more empirically focused. Where the academy emphasised mathematics and abstract reasoning, the Lyceum collected specimens, dissected animals, gathered data, and built what was essentially the ancient world's first research library. Aristotle wanted his students to study the actual world, not just contemplate perfect forms. The school got the nickname peripatetic, which comes from the Greek word for walking around. This wasn't because they were wanderers or couldn't sit still. It was because Aristotle liked to teach while strolling through the covered walkways of the Lyceum. There's something about walking that helps thinking, as if the physical movement somehow facilitates intellectual movement as well. Imagine morning lectures where Aristotle and his advanced students would walk slowly through the colonnade discussing complex philosophical questions while the less advanced students listened and tried to keep up, both physically and intellectually. In the afternoons, Aristotle would give public lectures on more accessible topics, drawing crowds of interested Athenians who wanted to hear what this brilliant Macedonian philosopher had to say. The Lyceum became a centre for what we might call systematic research. Aristotle organised his students to collect and organise information on an unprecedented scale. They gathered constitutions from 158 different Greek city-states, analysing how different political systems worked. They collected biological specimens, built up a library of books and scrolls, and created charts and diagrams to organise information. This was revolutionary. Before Aristotle, philosophy was largely about individual thinkers developing their own systems. Aristotle turned philosophy into something more like a research enterprise, with multiple people working together to gather data, test hypotheses, and build cumulative knowledge. The library at the Lyceum was apparently extraordinary for its time. Aristotle collected not just philosophical works, but texts on every subject: history, medicine, drama, politics, and natural science. He understood that to think clearly about any topic, you needed to know what others had thought before you. It was an early version of the research library concept that would become essential to universities centuries later. During his morning sessions, Aristotle would address the more technical aspects of his philosophy. These weren't casual conversations, they were rigorous, systematic explorations of difficult questions. How do we gain knowledge? What is the nature of reality? What makes an action ethical? How should societies be organised? Aristotle approached these questions differently than Plato had. Instead of starting with abstract principles and deducing conclusions, he would often start with observations and work his way toward principles. He believed that philosophy should be grounded in how the world actually works, not in how we might wish it to work in some perfect realm of forms. His teaching method involved what we might call collaborative inquiry. He would raise a question, examine what previous thinkers had said about it, identify the difficulties with their answers, and then work toward his own solution, always testing his ideas against observations and common sense. The atmosphere at the Lyceum must have been intense but also collaborative. Students weren't just passively absorbing Aristotle's wisdom, they were actively engaged in research, debate, and the collective pursuit of knowledge. Some were dissecting animals and examining their organs, others were studying plant life or collecting information about different governments. Still others were working through logical problems or ethical questions. Aristotle himself was incredibly productive during these years. He wrote on an astonishing range of topics: physics, metaphysics, ethics, politics, poetics, rhetoric, biology, and psychology. His works weren't written in the polished literary style of Plato's dialogues. They read more like lecture notes or research papers, dense with argument and packed with observations. This wasn't because Aristotle couldn't write well. His lost dialogues were apparently beautifully written. It's because what survived were his working texts, the materials he used for teaching and research rather than for public consumption. It's like the difference between a professor's polished textbook and their lecture notes. The notes are rougher, but often contain more of the real thinking. The Lyceum attracted students from throughout the Greek world and beyond. Some came because of Aristotle's connection to Alexander, who was now conquering the Persian Empire and making Macedonia the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Others came because the Lyceum represented something new in education, not just learning to think, but learning to observe, analyse and understand the natural and human world. For 12 years, Aristotle led the Lyceum in this systematic investigation of reality. It was the most productive period of his intellectual life, when he synthesised everything he'd learned into comprehensive philosophical and scientific systems that would influence human thought for the next 2 millennia. But this productive period was about to end in a way that must have felt painfully familiar to Aristotle. Once again, political events would force him to leave Athens, once again demonstrating that philosophers, however wise, cannot escape the tumultuous currents of history. Before we discuss how Aristotle's time in Athens ended, let's explore what made his approach to knowledge so revolutionary, because this is really the heart of Aristotle's legacy, not any single discovery, but a whole new way of thinking about how we understand the world. Settle back into your cushions as we dive into philosophy, but I promise to keep it relaxed and avoid the kind of dense jargon that makes most people's eyes glaze over. Aristotle's ideas at their core are actually quite practical and grounded in common sense. Remember how Plato believed that true knowledge came from contemplating perfect, eternal forms that exist in some realm beyond the physical world? Aristotle looked at this theory and essentially said, "That's beautiful, but it doesn't help us understand the actual world we live in. If you want to understand horses, you don't contemplate the perfect form of horseness. You go observe actual horses." This might seem obvious to us now, but it was radical then. Aristotle was saying that the physical world isn't just imperfect copies of something better. It's real and worth studying for its own sake. That tree outside your window isn't a poor imitation of some perfect tree form. It's an actual tree with its own nature, and you can learn about trees by examining it. Aristotle developed what we call an empirical approach to knowledge. Empirical just means based on observation and experience. He believed that knowledge begins with our senses, what we see, hear, touch, taste, and smell. These sensations give us raw data about the world, which our minds then process into understanding. But Aristotle wasn't naive about this. He knew that senses can be deceived, and that appearances can be misleading. His solution was to combine observation with reason, to look carefully at many examples, notice patterns, and use logic to work out the principles underlying what we observe. His biological work shows this method perfectly. He didn't just look at one dolphin and declare he understood all dolphins. He examined many dolphins, dissected them, observed their behaviour, talked to fishermen about what they'd seen, and gradually built up a comprehensive understanding. It was painstaking, systematic work that required patience and attention to detail. Aristotle organised knowledge in ways that still influence how we think. He created the first system for classifying living things, grouping organisms by their shared characteristics. His categories weren't always perfect by modern standards, but the underlying method, observe similarities and differences, group things accordingly, look for the principles that explain the patterns, is still how biological classification works. Today, he applied the same systematic approach to other areas. In ethics, he observed how people actually live and what seems to make them happy, then worked out principles for good living based on these observations. In politics, he studied 158 different governments, noting what worked and what didn't, building a political science grounded in actual experience rather than abstract ideals. Aristotle's concept of causation was particularly influential. He argued that to truly understand something, you need to understand 4 different types of causes. Take a bronze statue as an example. The material cause is the bronze itself, what it's made of. The formal cause is the shape, the design of the statue. The efficient cause is the sculptor who made it. And the final cause is its purpose, why it was made. This framework might seem complicated at first, but it's actually quite intuitive. When you ask, why is this statue here? You might mean, what is it made of? Or, who made it? Or, what's it for? Aristotle recognized these as different types of questions that all contribute to complete understanding. His emphasis on final causes, on purpose and function, was especially important for biology. Aristotle understood that you can't fully understand an organ or organism without understanding what it's for. The heart makes sense when you understand it's for pumping blood. Eyes make sense when you understand they're for seeing. Everything in nature exists for a reason, serving some purpose in the organism's life. Now, Aristotle sometimes took this teleological thinking too far. He assumed that everything has a purpose assigned by nature, which isn't quite how evolution actually works. But his instinct that function and purpose are essential to understanding was fundamentally sound. Modern biology still asks, what is this for? Even if it answers that question in terms of evolutionary advantage rather than in inherent purpose. In logic, Aristotle literally invented formal logic as a discipline. He developed the syllogism, that method of reasoning where you start with 2 premises and derive a conclusion. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. It sounds simple, but Aristotle systematically worked out all the valid and invalid forms of this kind of reasoning, creating a tool for checking whether arguments actually make sense. For over 2,000 years, Aristotle's logic was essentially all of logic. It wasn't until the 19th century that mathematicians developed forms of logical reasoning that went beyond what Aristotle had created. That's an extraordinary intellectual achievement, creating a system so robust that it remains fundamentally sound for millennia. Aristotle's ethics emphasized something he called eudaimonia, usually translated as happiness or flourishing. But he didn't mean momentary pleasure or simple contentment. He meant living well in the fullest sense, developing your capacities, acting virtuously, engaging with your community, and using your reason well. The key to eudaimonia, Aristotle argued, is virtue, but virtue understood as a kind of skill, or excellence that you develop through practice. Courage isn't something you're born with, it's something you cultivate by repeatedly facing your fears appropriately. Generosity is a habit you develop by practicing giving well. Every virtue lies between 2 extremes. Courage between cowardice and recklessness, generosity between stinginess and wastefulness. This is practical ethics grounded in how people actually become good, rather than abstract theories about moral perfection. Aristotle understood that becoming a good person is like learning to play an instrument. It requires practice, guidance, and the formation of good habits over time. In all these areas, biology, logic, ethics, politics, Aristotle's method was similar. Start with careful observation. Notice patterns, work out underlying principles, test these principles against further observations, and build systematic understanding. It was the birth of organised science and systematic philosophy, even though Aristotle wouldn't have recognised those as separate disciplines. What made Aristotle's approach so revolutionary was this combination of respect for empirical observation, with confidence in human reason. He believed we could understand the world, not through divine revelation, not through pure mathematics divorced from reality, but through the careful, systematic application of our observational and rational faculties. This was optimistic without being naive, empirical without being merely fact-collecting, and systematic without being rigid. It was a vision of human knowledge as something we build gradually, collectively, through careful attention to reality and rigorous thinking about what we observe. And now, with your tea perhaps growing cold and your eyelids perhaps growing heavy, we need to see how Aristotle's story ends, because even the greatest philosophers cannot entirely control the historical currents that sweep them along. In 323 BCE, news reached Athens that would change everything. Alexander the Great had died in Babylon. At the age of 32, the empire he'd built with astonishing speed was already fracturing as his generals fought over the pieces. And in Athens, anti-Macedonian sentiment that had been simmering for years suddenly boiled over. Aristotle found himself in an impossible position. He was Macedonian by birth, had been Alexander's tutor, and maintained close connections to the Macedonian court. For 12 years, Athens had tolerated his presence because Macedonia's power made it necessary. But with Alexander dead and Macedonia temporarily weakened, old resentments surfaced. Someone brought charges of impiety against Aristotle, the same charge that had been used against Socrates a century earlier. The specific accusation was something about honouring a friend in ways reserved for gods, which sounds technical but was really just a pretext. The real issue was politics. Aristotle represented Macedonia, and Athens wanted to strike back at Macedonia however it could. Aristotle, now 61 years old, and having watched Socrates' fate unfold from his prison cell, made a different choice. He decided not to stay and face trial. According to tradition, he said he wouldn't let Athens sin twice against philosophy, a reference to Socrates' execution. So he left Athens, turning over the Lyceum to his student Theophrastus, and retired to Chalcis, his mother's hometown. Think about what this meant. For 12 years, Aristotle had built the Lyceum into the ancient world's premier research institution. He had gathered an incredible library, trained brilliant students, and created systematic approaches to nearly every field of knowledge. And now, because of politics he couldn't control, he had to walk away from it all. In Chalcis, Aristotle lived quietly for about a year. We don't know much about this final period of his life. He was likely working on his writings, perhaps revising and organising the vast body of work he'd produced over his lifetime. He may have been suffering from some illness. Ancient sources mention stomach problems, which given ancient medicine's limitations could have meant almost anything. In 322 BCE, just 1 year after leaving Athens, Aristotle died at the age of 62. It wasn't a dramatic death like Socrates' execution, or a mysterious one like Alexander's early demise. It was simply the end of a life that had been, by any measure, extraordinarily productive and influential. Aristotle left behind his daughter Pythias. His wife of the same name had died years earlier, and he'd later had a relationship with a woman, named Herpyllis, with whom he had a son named Nicomachus. His will, which survived, shows him as a thoughtful, caring person who made provisions for his family, his slaves, whom he freed, and even his concubine's future. It's a touching document that reveals the human side of this towering intellect, but more importantly, he left behind an intellectual legacy that would shape human thought for the next 2,000 years. His works, or rather the lecture notes and research texts that survived, were preserved and eventually edited by scholars in later centuries. They became the foundation for education throughout the Mediterranean world, and eventually throughout medieval Europe. Now comes one of the most fascinating parts of Aristotle's story. Not what he did during his life, but what happened to his ideas after his death. Because unlike many philosophers whose influence fades with time, Aristotle's impact actually grew over the centuries, spreading far beyond the Greek world he knew. After Aristotle's death, his writings were preserved by the Lyceum under Theophrastus's leadership, but they weren't immediately famous throughout the ancient world. For several centuries, Aristotle was known more for his published dialogues, works that haven't survived, than for the dense technical treatises we now have. Then came a strange period where Aristotle's works apparently disappeared from circulation. According to tradition, they were hidden in a cellar in Asia Minor to protect them from being seized, where they suffered damage from moisture and insects. Whether this story is entirely true or partly legend, we do know that Aristotle's major works were relatively unknown for a couple of centuries. In the 1st century BCE, a scholar named Andronicus of Rhodes collected and edited Aristotle's writings, organising them into the form we know today. This wasn't just filing papers, it was an act of reconstruction and interpretation that shaped how we read Aristotle. The arrangement of his works, the way they're grouped and titled, comes largely from Andronicus's editorial decisions. As Rome became the Mediterranean's dominant power, Greek philosophy spread throughout the empire. Aristotle's works became central to higher education. Young Romans who wanted philosophical training studied Aristotle along with Plato and the Stoics. His logic became the standard method for teaching reasoning, and his ethics a framework for thinking about the good life. But Aristotle's most significant journey was yet to come. As the Roman Empire declined and eventually fell in the West, much of Greek learning was lost in Europe. The sophisticated intellectual culture that had produced and preserved Aristotle's works crumbled as cities shrank. Trade declined, and literacy became increasingly rare outside monasteries. However, Aristotle's work survived in the Eastern Roman Empire, what we call the Byzantine Empire, centred on Constantinople. Byzantine scholars continued to read, copy and study Aristotle in Greek. Meanwhile, something extraordinary was happening further east. Islamic scholars in the expanding Arab world encountered Aristotle's works and recognised their value immediately. Beginning in the 8th century CE, a massive translation movement began in Baghdad and other centres of Islamic learning. Aristotle's treatises were translated from Greek into Arabic, often by Christian scholars working in Muslim courts. Islamic philosophers like Al-Farabi, Avicenna and Averroes didn't just translate Aristotle, they engaged with his ideas, wrote extensive commentaries, and integrated his philosophy with Islamic theology and science. Averroes in particular became such an important interpreter of Aristotle that medieval Europeans would later call him simply the commentator, while Aristotle was the philosopher. This Islamic engagement with Aristotle preserved his works and developed his ideas in ways that would prove crucial for European intellectual history. When Europe began to recover economically and culturally in the 11th and 12th centuries, scholars rediscovered Aristotle, but often through Arabic translations and Islamic commentaries, rather than directly from Greek sources. The reintroduction of Aristotle to Western Europe was like injecting intellectual electricity into a system that had been running on minimal power. Suddenly, European scholars had access to systematic treatments of logic, natural science, ethics, and metaphysics that far exceeded anything available in Latin. It was like upgrading from a basic toolset to a fully equipped workshop. But this created a problem. Much of Aristotle's philosophy, particularly his ideas about the eternity of the world and the nature of the soul, seemed to conflict with Christian theology. Church authorities were unsure whether this pagan Greek philosopher from ancient times should be taught in Christian universities. Enter Thomas Aquinas, a 13th century Dominican friar who accomplished one of the great intellectual syntheses in Western history. Aquinas carefully worked through Aristotle's philosophy, showing how it could be reconciled with Christian doctrine. He distinguished between what reason could discover, Aristotle's domain, and what required divine revelation, theology's domain, creating a framework where both could coexist. Aquinas' achievement meant that Aristotle became central to medieval university education. Students learned Aristotelian logic, physics, ethics, and metaphysics as the foundation for their studies. The University of Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, all the great medieval universities made Aristotle the core of their curriculum. For several centuries, Aristotle's authority was so great that Aristotle said so was considered a sufficient argument to settle most questions. This led to some absurdities. Scholars would debate how many teeth a horse has by analysing what Aristotle wrote rather than, just counting a horse's teeth. Aristotle himself, who emphasised observation, would have been appalled. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries involved, in many ways, overthrowing Aristotelian physics and cosmology. Galileo's experiments contradicted Aristotle's claims about motion. Harvey's discovery of blood circulation contradicted Aristotelian physiology. Newton's physics replaced Aristotelian explanations of how things move. But interestingly, even as scientists rejected Aristotle's specific conclusions, they often kept his method, the emphasis on observation, the search for causes, and the systematic organisation of knowledge. Modern science isn't Aristotelian, but it's arguably descended from Aristotle's approach to investigating nature. Today you might think Aristotle is just a historical curiosity, relevant only to scholars studying ancient philosophy, but his influence persists in surprising ways. Every time you use formal logic, you're using tools Aristotle developed. When you think about ethics in terms of character and virtue rather than just rules, you're thinking in Aristotelian terms. When scientists classify organisms or analyse functions, they're following procedures Aristotle pioneered. His political science, his analysis of poetry and drama, his psychology, and his understanding of how we form concepts, all of these continue to influence how we think, often without our realising it. Aristotle is like the foundation of a building you live in. You don't usually notice it, but everything rests on it. As your tea grows cold and the hour grows late, let's consider what Aristotle's life and work mean for us today. Because this isn't just ancient history, it's about how we understand the world and our place in it. Aristotle gave us something fundamental: confidence that the world is knowable through careful observation and clear thinking. Before him, Many people thought true knowledge required mystical insight or divine revelation. After him, it became possible to believe that ordinary human beings, using their senses and their reason, could genuinely understand reality. This is such a basic assumption for us that we barely notice it. When you wonder how something works and decide to look it up or experiment to find out, you're operating on Aristotelian principles. The idea that we can figure things out by observing carefully and thinking clearly, that's Aristotle's legacy. His emphasis on studying actual things in the actual world rather than abstract perfections influenced the entire development of science. Yes, scientists have rejected many of his specific conclusions. His physics, his astronomy, and his chemistry were wrong in important ways. But his method of systematic observation, careful classification, and looking for underlying principles, that's still how science works. Aristotle's virtue ethics has seen a remarkable revival in recent decades. Modern philosophers rediscovered that his approach to ethics, focusing on character, habits, and human flourishing rather than just rules and duties, addresses aspects of moral life that other ethical theories miss. How do we become good people? What does it mean to live well? These Aristotelian questions feel more relevant to many people than abstract debates about moral principles. His political science, with its careful analysis of different forms of government and what makes them work or fail, still informs political theory. His understanding that politics isn't about implementing perfect systems, but about finding arrangements that work for actual human beings with all their flaws, that's a lesson every generation needs to relearn. In education, Aristotle's model of learning through apprenticeship and hands-on experience with a master teacher influenced how universities developed and still shapes how we think about advanced education. The idea of gathering students around a wise teacher to pursue knowledge collectively, that's the Lyceum's legacy, still alive in graduate seminars and research groups. But perhaps Aristotle's most important legacy is something less tangible, his demonstration that human knowledge is cumulative, that we can build on what previous thinkers discovered, and that intellectual progress is possible. Before Aristotle, philosophers tended to create their own complete systems from scratch. Aristotle showed that you could start with what others had learned, identify their insights and errors, and build something better. This is how knowledge actually grows, not through lone geniuses inventing everything themselves, but through communities of thinkers building on each other's work. Every scientific paper that begins with a literature review, every philosopher who engages with previous traditions, every scholar who stands on the shoulders of giants, they're all following the model Aristotle established at the Lyceum. Aristotle also showed us that intellectual breadth matters. In our age of specialization, when experts know more and more about less and less, Aristotle reminds us that understanding anything fully requires understanding its connections to everything else. His interests spanned from marine biology to literary criticism, and from formal logic to political science, because he understood that reality doesn't come neatly divided into academic departments. There's something profoundly human about Aristotle's approach to knowledge. He wasn't interested in abstract perfection divorced from lived experience. He wanted to understand the world we actually inhabit, messy, complicated, full of purposes and functions and constant change. He believed that ordinary things, plants, animals, human relationships, political systems, were worthy of serious systematic study. This might sound obvious now, but it was revolutionary then and remains important today. How often do we dismiss the everyday as uninteresting, searching for something more exotic or dramatic to hold our attention? Aristotle teaches us to look closely at what's right in front of us, because ordinary reality is actually extraordinary when you examine it carefully. His life also reminds us that intellectual work happens in communities. Aristotle didn't develop his ideas in isolation. He learned from Plato, taught Alexander, collaborated with students at the Lyceum, and engaged with other philosophers. Knowledge is social, built through conversation, debate, teaching, and collaborative investigation. And yet Aristotle's story also carries a cautionary note. His systematic approach sometimes became too rigid. His confidence in human reason sometimes led to speculation beyond what observation could support, and his influence eventually became so great that it stifled rather than stimulated inquiry. Aristotle said so became an excuse to stop thinking rather than a starting point for further investigation. This tension between respect for tradition and openness to new discovery is something every field of knowledge must navigate. We need to learn from the past without being imprisoned by it, to respect previous thinkers without treating their words as sacred scripture. Aristotle himself would have understood this. He honoured Plato while departing from Platonic philosophy, and learned from his predecessors while correcting their errors. As we near the end of our journey with Aristotle, imagine him in those final months in Chalcis, looking back on his 62 years. What did he think about when he reflected on his life? We can't know for certain, but we can imagine. Perhaps he thought about his childhood in Macedonia, watching his father practice medicine with careful attention to symptoms and treatments. Those early lessons in observation stayed with him throughout his life, shaping his entire approach to knowledge. Perhaps he remembered arriving in Athens as a young man, feeling provincial and out of place, but discovering at Plato's academy an intellectual home that would shape him for 20 years. Even as he eventually departed from Plato's teachings, he never forgot what he learned there. The importance of rigorous argument, the value of questioning assumptions, and the pursuit of truth wherever it leads. He might have smiled, remembering his time teaching young Alexander, that energetic, ambitious teenager who would grow up to conquer the world. Did Aristotle feel pride at his students' achievements, or dismay at how different Alexander's path was from the contemplative life Aristotle advocated? Probably both. Like any teacher watching a brilliant student make choices they wouldn't have made themselves. Surely he thought about his years at the Lyceum, those productive, satisfying years when he'd finally been able to pursue his own vision of what philosophy and science should be. The morning walks with advanced students discussing complex questions while strolling through shaded colonnades. The afternoon public lectures share knowledge with anyone interested enough to listen. The collaborative research projects have students collecting data on everything from fish to governments. He might have felt regret about leaving Athens, forced out by political circumstances beyond his control. To build something significant and then have to abandon it must have been painful. But perhaps he found some comfort in knowing he'd trained capable students like Theophrastus, who could carry on his work. If Aristotle had known how his ideas would travel through time, translated into Arabic, preserved by Islamic scholars, reintroduced to Europe, becoming the foundation of medieval universities, influencing thinkers for 2,000 years, what would he have thought? Probably a mixture of satisfaction and bemusement, especially at the ways his ideas would be misunderstood, ossified into dogma, and eventually partially overturned. But he would likely have been pleased that his fundamental approach, careful observation, systematic thinking, and the belief that the world is knowable, continued to influence how humans pursue understanding. That was his real contribution, not any specific doctrine, but a whole way of approaching knowledge. Aristotle understood that knowledge is always provisional, always subject to refinement as we learn more. His works constantly engage with previous thinkers, building on their insights and correcting their errors. He would have expected, probably hoped, that future thinkers would do the same with his work. In his final days, perhaps Aristotle found peace in having lived a life devoted to understanding. He'd started with nothing but curiosity and intelligence, and he'd used these to investigate nearly every aspect of reality accessible to human inquiry. He'd been a student, a teacher, a researcher, a founder of institutions, and a systematizer of knowledge. He'd loved his wife, Pythias, his companion, Herpyllis, and his children. He'd formed friendships with students and colleagues. He'd experienced political success and political exile. He'd known the satisfaction of intellectual breakthrough and the frustration of unanswered questions. In short, he'd lived a fully human life while also living a life of the mind. The ancient Greeks had a concept that Aristotle wrote about extensively: eudaimonia, human flourishing, living well. By his own account, this came from developing your capacities, acting virtuously, engaging meaningfully with others, and using your reason well. By these measures, Aristotle had indeed achieved eudaimonia, even if his life ended in exile rather than triumph. When he died in 322 BCE, Aristotle probably had no idea that he was, in a sense, immortal. His body would decay like all physical things. He understood biology too well to imagine otherwise. But his ideas, his methods, and his approach to understanding the world, these would outlast empires and influence civilizations he'd never heard of. That's a legacy worth reflecting on as you drift towards sleep. A single person, through careful thought and systematic inquiry, can influence how millions of future people understand reality. The questions Aristotle asked the methods he developed, and the knowledge he systematized, these became tools that countless others would use to build their own understanding. As you settle into that space between waking and sleeping, where thoughts become less linear and more dreamlike, consider this. Aristotle's greatest achievement wasn't any single discovery, but showing that the world is comprehensible. Before him, many people thought that true understanding required mystical revelation or abstract mathematics divorced from physical reality. After him, it became possible to believe that ordinary people could understand the world by looking carefully, thinking clearly, and building knowledge systematically. Every time you try to understand something by observing it carefully, you're following Aristotle's path. Every time you classify things by their similarities and differences, you're using Aristotle's method. Every time you ask, "What is this for?" or "How does this work?" you're asking Aristotelian questions. You might never have studied Aristotle in school. You might not be able to name a single one of his books, but his influence is in the very air you breathe intellectually, in how you think about causes, in how you understand living things, in how you reason about ethics, and in your assumption that the world makes sense and can be understood. This is what it means to be a foundational thinker. Not that everything you say is correct. Aristotle was wrong about many things, but that you change how people think about thinking itself. You create tools that others can use, methods that others can follow, and frameworks that others can build upon. Aristotle showed us that knowledge is not something revealed from above, but something built from below, starting with simple observations and building toward comprehensive understanding. He demonstrated that you don't need mystical insights or mathematical perfection to understand reality. You need careful attention, clear thinking, and the patience to work through problems systematically. This optimistic view of human knowledge, that we can figure things out, that the world is knowable, that reason and observation together can lead us toward truth, remains one of civilization's most important assumptions. When we doubt it, science stops, inquiry ends, and we retreat into authority and tradition. Aristotle also reminds us that intellectual work is deeply human. It happens in communities of teachers and students. It requires conversation and debate. It builds on what others have learned. It connects to the practical concerns of living well. Knowledge isn't just abstract information. It's part of how we flourish as human beings. As sleep approaches and this story ends, remember that the quiet philosopher from Stagira, who spent his life observing, thinking, and teaching, changed the world, more profoundly than many conquerors. His student Alexander's empire fell apart within years of his death. But Aristotle's intellectual empire, his methods, his insights, his approach to understanding, has lasted more than 2 millennia and shows no signs of disappearing. Tomorrow, when you wake and observe the world around you, noticing patterns, asking questions, trying to understand how things work, you'll be thinking in ways that Aristotle helped make possible. The morning light streaming through your window illuminates a world that Aristotle taught us could be studied and understood, rather than merely feared or worshipped. That's his gift to us. Confidence that the world makes sense, methods for making sense of it, and the belief that understanding is worth pursuing for its own sake, not for power or wealth or fame, but simply for the joy of knowing, the satisfaction of understanding, and the human fulfillment that comes from using our minds well. Sleep now, with gratitude for this ancient Greek physician's son who devoted his life to helping humanity wake up to the intelligibility of the world. May your dreams be full of wonder at the patterns that connect all things, the purposes that animate living creatures, and the joy of understanding that makes us most fully human. And when you wake, may you see the world with fresh eyes, not as a chaos of random events, but as Aristotle taught us to see it, as a cosmos, an ordered whole that our minds are capable of comprehending, one careful observation and clear thought at a time. Sweet dreams, and may Aristotle's spirit of systematic wonder follow you into sleep and beyond. In Ireland, 5:36, brother Kieran wakes to a half-light seeping through the shutters. Although it is dawn, the sky still wears the same grim shade as it did at dusk. In the monastery kitchen, the last of the winter barley has been ground. The coarse flour barely rises when baked, yielding a handful of firm flatbread. He offers a loaf to a gaunt villager at the gate. The man's trembling hands cradle it as though it were a feast. It is the only food Kieran can spare. All around Cloyne Moor the fields lie barren. By Beltane they should be green with new barley, but instead patches of stunted sprouts struggle from cold, blighted soil. A ragged woman clutching a silent, hollow-eyed child begs Kieran for help. He closes his eyes in pained prayer, knowing the monastery's granary is almost empty. All winter there were whispers that the sun's light had changed. Even now in spring it glows weakly, more grey than gold, giving no warmth. At midday the villagers found no shadows following their feet on the ground. Frosts came hard even after Imbolc, blackening the early shoots. Kieran crosses himself, recalling tales of the biblical plague of darkness, but that lasted only 3 days, whereas this malaise drags on week after the week. Some of the older monks murmur that it's as though the sky itself is a hide stretched over the sun, a perpetual eclipse. At times a fine grey haze drifts through the air, carrying a bitter smell. It has brought hunger and despair to their land, regardless of its cause. To Kieran, it feels as like the very air has turned against them. In the village, cattle low with hunger. Many were slaughtered months ago because there was no hay. The usual cheerful birdsong of spring is muted. Some mornings, thick dew lies frozen on the thatch, unheard of this late in the year. That afternoon, Kieran ventures to the village chapel. Inside, it is crowded with peasants seeking solace. The air is heavy with sweat and fear. He raises his hands and speaks of Job's trials, of keeping faith through hardship. As he prays, his voice wavers. He notices an old man in the back not genuflecting, one of the few who still cling to the old druidic ways. The old man's eyes are clouded with accusation. "Where is your god of light now?" the elder croaks when the prayers end. Nuada's silver hand would sooner bring back the sun than these Latin words. A few villagers nod, desperate for any remedy. Rumours swirl of ancient rites on the hill, offerings to appease whatever spirit has devoured the sun. Kieran feels a spark of anger, but mostly pity. In this dark time, people grasp at any hope. That evening a thin rain falls, barely moistening the hard earth. In the scriptorium's candle glow, Brother Kieran opens the magnificent chronicle. His quill hovers above the page for the year. How to summarise this living nightmare? He dips in ink and writes in careful Latin script, Anno Domini 536, Fame Panis in Hibernia. The year 536 was marked by a shortage of bread. The words feel inadequate, mere scratchings to mark children dying in their mother's arms, an entire family is wandering in search of food that does not exist. And yet he must record it for posterity, as truthfully and simply as the annals of old. His hand shakes with exhaustion. Before blowing out the candle, Kieran adds a final thought in the margin. Sol pallidus supra nos est. The sun is pale above us. Outside, the rain stops. The night is deathly quiet. Brother Kieran steps out and looks upward. Where he should see a tapestry of stars, there is only a dull haze and the ruddy disk of a moon drained of its splendour. He thinks of the hungry faces he saw today. In the morning he will venture farther, maybe to the next valley, to see if they fared any better. Perhaps there will be news from beyond the seas that could explain this pall, or is it the wrath of God? He does not know. Pulling his thin cloak tighter, the monk whispers a hymn into the gloom. His Latin words tremble with both doubt and hope, drifting upward in a world that has seemingly lost the sun. In Constantinople, Eastern Roman Empire, 536. Stephanos steps out of the granary and into an eerie midday gloom. The Forum of Constantine should be bright at this hour, but the sun hangs weak in the sky, its light pale and without brightness. Under the colonnade, a brazier has ignited, providing flickering light where the sun cannot. Normally at noon, the great column's shadow would slice across the marble pavement. Today there is none. Stephanos pauses, bread ledger in hand, and suppresses a shiver. In his 30 years in Constantinople, he has never seen the sun like this. It's as if the day has been swallowed by an endless eclipse. He hurries through the forum, passing knots of anxious citizens. At the steps of the Hagia Sophia construction site, a knot of labourers kneel in prayer. Tools idle. Even the patriarch has ordered continual prayers, for fear that God's anger is upon the empire. Stephanos does not stop. As a junior official of the grain dole, his duty is to assess the city's bread supply. And the news is grim. The wheat shipments from Egypt have dwindled. The harvests up the Nile were poor this year. Fields yielded scant grain. Although the imperial granaries remain full, the customary surpluses have vanished. In the bread market, he sees long queues of gaunt faces. An elderly woman clutches her stomach, muttering that famine now rides alongside war like the black horseman of the apocalypse. Stephanos silently crosses himself at that, quickening his pace. Inside the Augustaion, a cluster of senators argues in low voices. Stephanos catches fragments as he passes. One laments that the blighted sun, which began during Consul Belisarius's year, is a dire omen. Another frets that if the produce is destroyed by this bad time, the legions will starve. Men are free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death, an elderly senator concludes. No one disagrees. At the docks on the Golden Horn, grain barges from Alexandria are being unloaded under the dim sun. The usual cacophony of stevedores is hushed. Everyone moves with the worried calm of men who know they carry precious food. Stephanos inspects the offloaded sacks. The wheat kernels are small, shrunken by poor yield. "Is this all?" he asks the harbour master. A shrug. "Afraid so. Even the bread basket of the world struggles now." Stephanos nods and makes a mark on his wax tablet. In the past, Egypt's bounty could feed Constantinople twice over. Now any shortage sends prices climbing. Already he has heard of riots in the poorer quarters at dawn when the meagre bread allotments ran out. He muses grimly about the concept of bread and circuses. Crossing back toward the palace, Stephanos peers up at the sky. The sun's hue is a strange bluish white, and the very air seems thick. A dry, foggy haze hangs high above, dulling the daylight. Some call it an omen, others say it's a natural miasma. One pamphlet circulating in the forum even claimed that a volcano in some far-off land must have vomited ash into the heavens, promptly confiscated by the urban prefect for spreading alarm. Stephanos does not know what to believe. He only knows that the empire lacks experience with simultaneous harvest failures across all regions. In the past, if Syria suffered drought, Egypt might compensate. But now Syria also reports withered crops and empty granaries. An empire that commands the Mediterranean cannot command the skies. That night, the city is preternaturally quiet. By decree, a candle-lit vigil is held in every church. Stephanos stands among a crowd in the great church's half-built nave. The air smells of wax and incense. By day, hundreds of tiny flames flicker where sunlight should stream in. The patriarch leads a solemn chant, beseeching God to restore the light and spare his people. Stephanos bows his head and joins the chorus. His mind wanders to his young daughter at home, who has known constant cough and hunger these past months. The sun gave forth light without brightness, like the moon. He remembers those words from a scholar's chronicle, and they ring true in his bones. He prays for the day he can show his child a bright, warm sun again. Until then, they endure in the half-light of an empire under siege by the very heavens. In the kingdom of Axum, Ethiopia 536, Miriam's sandals are worn thin by the time she and her little brother crest the last hill before Axum. Below them, the city's familiar landmarks rise from the plain, the tall stone stellae of bygone kings casting faint shadows in the ashen daylight, and beyond, the spires of the great stone church where her people have worshipped for generations. She urges her brother onward with a gentle hand. They have walked for 2 days from their village, driven by desperation. At home, the fields of teff and sorghum utterly failed. This year's rains never arrived, and the soil cracked beneath a brazen but feeble sun. Along the road they joined a trickle of other villagers and farmers, all converging toward Axum like streams to a dry riverbed. They strolled past the abandoned ox carcasses by the roadside and the deserted farms with nothing left to harvest. At the city gates, Miriam feels a surge of relief. They have arrived. But the sight before her quickly tempers that hope. Axum's marketplace, usually vibrant with traders from far lands, has been transformed into an open-air soup kitchen. Cook fires gutter under large cauldrons of porridge. Hundreds of people gather in lines, clutching bowls or baskets, their faces gaunt. The smell of thin millet gruel mingles with the acrid scent of despair. Miriam clutches her brother's hand and finds a spot at the end of a line. Overhead, the sky is a flat, dull white, the sun's disk barely visible. A local deacon moves down the line, intoning prayers in Ge'ez. He sprinkles holy water on the crowd from a palm frond. Normally, people save such blessings for festivals, but now they perform them to combat hopelessness. A small caravan arrives with a few camels laden with grain from the coast, but after a brief exchange with officials, most of it turns away. Even the major trade routes bring no food now. In Axum's markets, one could once buy pepper from India, or wine from Nubia. Now even the humblest barley loaf is a treasure. As the line inches forward, Miriam passes by a group of nobles and priests gathered under an incense tree. She recognises Negus Caleb, King Caleb, among them by the gold-fringed cloth draped over his shoulders and the ornate processional cross he leans upon. Her ears catch an advisor reporting that the Nile's flood was weak, and even across the Red Sea no stores remain. The king's shoulders sag under his embroidered cloak. At last he raises his hands and calls out, "People of Aksum, God is testing us. We will open the last of the royal granaries to feed the hungry, share what you receive, and trust that the Lord will provide." A murmur of gratitude ripples through the throng. Miriam finally reaches the front. A deacon ladles a scoop of watery porridge into her clay bowl. It is not much, barely a few mouthfuls for each of them, but she murmurs, "A mess agin lahu, thank you," with a deep bow. Her brother swallows his portion greedily, licking the bowl. She forces herself to eat slowly, savouring each drop. Around her, others huddle on the ground in silence, some weeping with relief for this small mercy. At sunset, King Caleb leads a candle-lit procession through the streets. Miriam and her brother stand among the faithful lining the route. The king walks barefoot, carrying the gilded cross, followed by priests bearing icons. Their chants of Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, echo off the towering stellae. As the procession passes, Miriam closes her eyes and joins the singing. Never has she felt the community so united. Nobles and peasants, priests and paupers, all imploring heaven for deliverance. In the failing light, the king lifts the cross to bless the entire land. Miriam tightens her arm around her brother. Though hunger gnaws and the darkness endures, in that moment she takes solace in their collective hope. Under the mournful sky of 536, the people of Aksum face the long night together, their faith unbroken even as the world around them withers. Though hardship was far from over, a spark of hope persisted. Like dawn following the longest night, they trusted that better days would come again. In northern China, 536, the sky should have been a brilliant blue above the rice paddies, but today it is the colour of lead. Farmer Liang squints at the field where his family's livelihood lies. It is the 7th month of the year, high summer, yet a bitter wind rattles the stalks. Suddenly one of his sons cries out. Liang looks down in disbelief as snowflakes swirl onto the green rice shoots. Within minutes, a rare summer snowfall dusts the paddies, bending the young rice. The villagers stand helplessly by. Such a thing has never happened in living memory. Autumn brings no relief. The harvest is paltry and stunted, weeks late in ripening. By the 8th month, the famine is undeniable, the granaries are nearly empty. Liang's family begins mixing chaff and acorns into their rice to make it stretch. His youngest daughter stops growing. Her cheeks are sunken and grey. One afternoon, a yellow powder drifts down from the sky, coating the village roofs in a film like ash. Villagers fear it is a curse from heaven. Whatever the cause, the crops are ruined, and hunger stalks the land. In the village temple, the headman burns incense before the altar of the earth god. The air is thick with smoke and the murmured prayers of desperate farmers. "We must appease heaven to now," the headman declares, sweat beading on his brow despite the cold. As night falls, the villagers carry an offering of their last millet and a slaughtered goat to the hill shrine. Liang watches as the small procession winds up the slope with lanterns bobbing. He holds his shivering daughter close. They set the offerings and bow until their foreheads touch the ground, begging for mercy, good weather, a decent harvest, anything. But the night sky offers no reply, only a faint glow where the moon hides behind a strange haze. The offering remains untouched by any deity. Weeks pass and starvation sets in. Liang feeds his children thin congee made from wild herbs and tree bark. His elderly mother quietly refuses her portion, pretending she has eaten so that the little ones might have more. Soon she grows too frail to leave her bed. One cold morning, Liang finds that her breathing has stopped. With shaking hands, he covers her body with a woven mat. There is no energy or grain to spare for proper funeral rites. Before her death, his mother had whispered that perhaps the emperor had lost heaven's mandate. How else to explain the son's betrayal? In grief, Liang wonders if the distant court's sins have brought on heaven's wrath. They hear of hungry folk in nearby provinces attacking granaries, but in Liang's village, though desperation grows, order holds for now. By early winter, bandits roam the countryside, stealing what little remains. One night a gang of starving young men, once farmers from a nearby hamlet, break into Liang's storehouse, seizing the meagre sack of millet he had hidden. There are scuffles in the dark. His eldest son is struck with a staff while trying to defend their food. The thieves flee into the night, leaving the family bruised and without a single grain of food. When dawn breaks, Liang makes a decision. He gathers his family and tells them they can stay no longer. If they remain in the village, they will surely die. Rumours suggest that the harvests were better further south. Perhaps they could find food and employment there. That day the family packs what little they have left. Liang hoists his weakened daughter onto his back. He takes one last look at the fields of their ancestors, now barren, dusted with frost. Together the family joins a small band of neighbours on the road heading south, leaving behind their village to whatever fate the heavens had decreed. As they vanished into the white distance, their footprints were swiftly blanketed by the new snow, one family among countless others on the road that winter, all seeking a land where the sun still shone and grain could be found. It was the second year without a summer in Scandinavia, 536. In a seaside village of what would one day be called Sweden, Jarl Einar stood on the frozen shore at noon and saw no sun above, only a dim glow behind the grey sky. The world felt stuck in twilight. Fishermen had to chip through ice where the bay had frozen solid, hoping to catch a few starved cod. Inland, the fields lay under dirty snow even in what should have been the growing season. Einar's people had slaughtered most of their livestock last autumn. There was no fodder to keep them alive through another barren year. Half the benches in the hall were now empty. The strong had ventured south to gentler climates, and the frail had perished in the first famine winter. Inside the Jarl's longhouse a small fire flickered weakly. Einar passed a hand over the embers and thought of the sun, once the great fire in the sky now vanished. His gut clenched with a mix of sorrow and dread. The village's priestess, Volva, had warned that they could be living through Fimbulvetur, the legendary great winter of Norse prophecy. 3 winters with no summer between, a prelude to Ragnarok, the end of the gods. Einar had scoffed at the time, but now he was not so sure. To placate the gods, they had tried everything. The previous fall they sacrificed their finest ram and a pair of oxen to Freyr at harvest, yet the snows came early and stayed. In the spring Einar himself cast a gold arm ring into the peat bog as an offering. Many nobles were said to be abandoning their treasures to the earth in hopes of buying back the sun. Still, the gods remained silent, and the sun's chariot did not return. By midwinter of that second sunless year, desperation hung like a fog. The village elders grimly agreed that only a human sacrifice might break the curse. That night, they offered up a captured thrall under the frost-covered ash tree, spilling his blood in Odin's name. But when dawn broke in yet another leaden sky, they knew even that was not enough. As spring of the 3rd year approached with little change, whispers began in the village. Some said that the Jarl's bloodline was cursed, that Odin and Freyr would accept nothing less than the life of the chieftain himself to set things right, just as in ancient tales a king had once been sacrificed to end a blight. Einar heard these murmurs and knew in his heart what had to be done. The next day he called an assembly at the sacred grove. Mustering his remaining strength, he addressed the tribe. "I will go to Odin's hall if it brings back the sun and the harvest," he declared. Gasps rippled through the crowd. His wife wailed, but he raised a hand gently. "We have all lost loved ones. If my life buys the dawn for those who remain, I give it freely." That evening, under the steel-grey sky, Jarl Einar knelt before the old oak tree in the grove. The Volva and 2 elders stood solemnly by with ceremonial knives. Einar's breath rose in white puffs. He felt no fear now, only a strange peace, as though he were already halfway to Valhalla. In a clear voice he chanted a final prayer, a plea for Thor to smash the dark clouds and for Freyr to make the fields green once more. As the blade touched his skin, he closed his eyes and pictured golden summer sunlight. The knives did their work, and Einar slumped forward, life leaching into the frozen ground. A low moan of grief and hope rose from the villagers. After laying his body on a pyre with his cloak and shield, they ignited it, causing the flames to roar upwards. Throughout the long night they kept vigil, and then, in the early hours, a pale glow appeared in the eastern sky, stronger than any in months. As the sky lightened from black to murky blue, the villagers saw the outline of the sun, wan but emerging at last through a break in the haze. A murmur of awe swept over the crowd. They wept with joy, lifting their faces to feel its faint warmth. Whether it was Jarl Einar's noble sacrifice or simply the turning of fate, none could say, but the endless winter was finally loosening its grip. In the coming days, as the snows began to recede, the people raised a mound for their chieftain, honouring him as the saviour who gave himself so that spring could return. In the massive city of Chacruz, in modern El Salvador, or what we call Mesoamerica, in 536, the high priest Itzamnaj knelt before the temple's altar at midday. All around him, hundreds of people crowded the plaza in tense silence. For months the sun had hidden its face. A strange chill hung over the usually hot lands of the Maya. Crops of maize and cacao wilted in the unseasonal cool and dim light. The priests had consulted their calendars and made offerings of incense and jade, but nothing availed. Today they would entreat Kinich Ajor, the sun god, with the most precious offering of all, human blood. Itzamnaj rose to his feet and stretched his arms to the sky. On the altar stone before him lay a bound captive, painted blue for sacrifice. "O Lord of the sun, rise and eat, that you may shine upon us again," the priest cried out. A murmur of desperation rippled through the crowd. Using an obsidian blade, Itzamnaj swiftly opened the victim's chest. The crowd gasped as he raised the still-beating heart toward the heavens. "May this blood nourish you, O gods!" he shouted, his voice cracking. At that instant the ground shuddered violently. The ritual chant died on every tongue. Itzamnaj staggered, dropping the heart. A low rumble rolled through the earth. Suddenly the western horizon ignited with a pillar of fire. A volcano in the distance had exploded with unimaginable force. A massive plume of black ash rose, turning day into night in an instant. People screamed and scattered. Itzamnaj stood frozen atop the temple as he watched a wall of ash and rock hurtle toward the city, illuminated by eerie orange flames. The gods had answered, not with salvation, but with catastrophe. Within minutes, searing hot ash rained down upon Chacruz. Thatch roofs and wooden beams burst into flame. Men, women and children ran desperately for shelter. But there was none. Itzamnaj barely managed to scramble down the temple steps when a blast of furnace-hot wind knocked him flat. The air itself burned. He could not draw a breath without scorching his lungs. A torrent of pumice and ash buried temples and huts within hours. Those who did not die under falling debris succumbed to the suffocating soot and toxic gases. The proud city, its palaces, its ball courts, its altars, was being entombed in grey powder. Itzamnaj crawled, coughing, into the shelter of the temple courtyard wall. Through eyes stinging with ash, he beheld a scene from the darkest underworld. The sacred ceiba trees around the plaza were ablaze, and charred bodies lay strewn where moments ago the faithful had gathered. He clutched his obsidian dagger to his chest, numb with shock and guilt. Was this cataclysm the sun god's wrath for their offerings, or had the death of the sacrificial victim somehow unleashed a greater curse? His mind swam as the very ground continued to heave. Over the roar of the volcano he thought he heard the distant cruel laughter of the death gods. Hours later, a thick, unnatural darkness cloaked the land. The eruption's fury had finally ceased, leaving an eerie silence. Where the thriving city of Chacruz had stood was now a mouldering grey wasteland, buried under layers of ash. Itzamnaj, miraculously still alive, pulled himself from the ashen debris. The once clear river ran black with volcanic dust. He limped through the ruins, calling out the names of his wife and son, but heard no answer, only the faint crackle of cooling cinders. His sandals sank into the hot ash covering the plaza. The once grand temple lay in shattered ruins, half-buried corpses strewn everywhere. Overhead, the sky remained as dark as midnight, though it was long past noon. Itzamnaj stumbled to the edge of the city where the fields began. Nothing remained of the maize rows, only a ghostly landscape of ash dunes. The sun was completely veiled, and fine grey particles drifted through the air like deadly snow. The priest sank to his knees and raised trembling hands to the unseen sky. "Why?" he croaked, voice broken. There was no one left to hear his questions. In that moment, it seemed to Itzamnaj that the gods had abandoned the world entirely. He looked up at the churning darkness above, knowing that beyond this poisoned sky the sun still existed, but its light might not return for a long, long time. As the lone survivor began to wail amid the desolation, the suffocating ash cloud spread far beyond, ensuring that 536 would be remembered as a year of unparalleled darkness and sorrow, even in lands far from this doomed city. Across the world, as I have covered, the year 536 left a scar on the human story. In its wake, kingdoms faltered and populations were decimated. Chroniclers from Ireland to China recorded unusual cold summer snow, failed crops and famine. They wrote of a dry fog dimming the sun's light, of skies coloured with ash, and of hunger stalking the land. For 18 long months, much of the earth lay under a pall of gloom. In Europe and the Near East, people looked for divine meaning in the calamity. Christian writers wondered if Revelation's apocalyptic horsemen were unleashed. War, famine, pestilence, and death all seemed present at once. Indeed, the historian Procopius wrote that men were free neither from war nor pestilence nor any other thing leading to death during those dark days. The plague of Justinian, which followed the famine, soon checked Emperor Justinian's ambitions in the Eastern Roman Empire. In the British Isles, Celtic monks noted a failure of bread. Far to the east, Chinese records spoke of great cold and summer frost that ruined the harvest. Northern Europeans were so desperate they offered their riches and kings to appease their gods. And in Central America, a volcano's cataclysmic eruption blanketed the skies with ash, plunging entire regions into darkness. Societies across the globe, separated by vast oceans and unaware of each other, shared the same despair. The sun that year was a feeble ghost above the horizon, a shared anguish in Ireland's green hills, Constantinople's marble streets, Axum's highlands, China's villages, Scandinavia's forests, and Mesoamerica's jungles. Millions perished as famine and disease swept through communities already weakened by crop failure. It was, by all accounts, one of the darkest times in recorded history. Some later scholars would even call 536 the worst year to be alive. And yet not all hope died. In every story of suffering there were those who endured. Parents who shared their last crust with their kids, leaders who died for their people, and communities that prayed and performed rituals to find meaning in the chaos. They adapted in the face of collapse, migrating to new lands, changing their traditions and rebuilding from the ashes. The darkness would slowly lift. From 537 to 538, the sunlight grew stronger as the dust in the sky settled. Fields were sown anew. Children born after the year without sun would grow up under blue skies, hearing the hushed stories of the terrible darkness their elders survived. Looking back, the catastrophe of 536 stands as a testament to human endurance. It was a year of tragedy on a scale almost beyond comprehension, a convergence of natural disasters that humbled empires and small villages alike. But it was also a year that showed the resilience of the human spirit. In Ireland, monks kept the flame of learning alive through the long winter. In Byzantium, officials and neighbours shared what food they could to keep the starving alive. In Axum, faith and charity helped a kingdom pull through its worst famine. In Scandinavia, a people's devotion to their gods, however grim, kept their community united until the sun's return. Despite the loss of the Maya city in our story, other cities in Mesoamerica continued to exist, safeguarding knowledge and culture for future generations. Eventually the sun did return, brighter and warmer, as it always had before. The year 536 passed into history, its horrors softened by time, but those who lived through it would never forget how fragile their world could be. For a year it felt like night had fallen and the gods had abandoned humanity. Why wouldn't you last a day in 536? The people of that era faced unimaginable challenges, a sun that never shone, unfulfilled harvests, and a darkness that pushed the boundaries of hope. They persevered through faith, courage, and the fragile bonds of community, demonstrating that despite the most challenging year, humanity's determination to survive remained unwavering. In the end, dawn broke through the darkness, and life prevailed, scarred, changed, but ever hopeful beneath the returning light of the sun.